Hey there, tonight we're uncovering how Roman gladiators survived their grueling training routines. Not the Hollywood version, you know, but a tale where strategic dieting and camaraderie played as much a role as the sword and shield. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now find your comfort zone, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's venture into tonight's story together. You find yourself standing in the shadow of the Colosseum, yet you're not here for the blood-soaked spectacle. No, your new home is the Ludus, the gladiator school, where life is a mix of discipline, economics, and a hefty dose of reality. Forget the Hollywood version where every gladiator is a rogue warrior with a six-pack and a death wish. The truth, you're more of a high-stakes investment than a suicidal entertainer. First things first, you're expensive, like really expensive. Training a gladiator costs around 2,000 sesterces, a small fortune to most Romans. We're talking about enough to buy a nice house or several slaves. And you thought college tuition was bad, but why so pricey? Well, you're not just learning how to swing a sword or dodge a trident. You're mastering the art of survival, which, spoiler alert, is kind of the point. Your Lannister, the guy who owns you, isn't just throwing money at you to see you get skewered in your first fight. He wants a return on his investment, which means keeping you alive long enough to win over the crowd and rake in the bets. Now, let's talk about your digs. The Ludus isn't exactly a five-star resort. It's more of a cross between boot camp and a Roman version of The Biggest Loser. Sure, you're fed a diet rich in beans and barley to bulk you up, rather than the lean, mean fighting machine you're picturing. Yeah, you're basically carbo-loading like a marathon runner crossed with a sumo wrestler. But hey, those extra pounds help cushion the blows, and more importantly, make you look more imposing in the arena. Forget keto. This is the gladiator version of bulking season. And then there's the discipline. Oh, the discipline. You train for hours a day under the watchful eyes of veteran gladiators and instructors who make sure you don't just flail around like a madman with a sword. It's all about technique, precision, and surprisingly, teamwork. Because, believe it or not, gladiators often fought in pairs or teams, and knowing how to cover your buddy's back could mean the difference between life and death. So while the movies love to show lone wolves, the reality is more like a Roman buddy cop film, with less humor and more helmets. But here's where it gets interesting. This isn't all about the thrill of combat. It's also about economics. The games are a major part of the Roman economy. They keep the masses entertained, the politicians popular, and the betting offices busy. You're like a pawn in an elaborate game of chess, where every move is calculated and every piece has a purpose. The crowd wants blood, sure, but they also want a good show, and a dead gladiator isn't nearly as entertaining as one who can put on a spectacle. Now, let's debunk a myth or two. The idea that every fight ended in death. Total nonsense. In reality, most matches were more like the WWE than Game of Thrones. The goal was to entertain, not to empty the roster. After all, if every fight ended in a funeral, there wouldn't be many gladiators left by the end of the season. So, while you might be risking life and limb, every time you step into the arena, your Lannister is banking on your survival. You're like an ancient version of a professional athlete, with all the fame and none of the free agency. So, as you stand there, sweating through your tunic under the hot Roman sun, remember this: you're more than just a fighter. You're a key player in a grand economic machine, a living, breathing asset in a world where your value is measured in both sesterces and survival. And while the crowd chants for blood behind the scenes, it's all about the money, honey. Welcome to the life of a Roman gladiator, where the stakes are high, the food is weirdly healthy, and the odds, well, they're ever in your favor, if you play your cards right. And as the sun rises on another day in the Ludus, you're quickly reminded that being a gladiator is less about dying gloriously and more about surviving relentlessly. Forget the flashy sword twirls and death-defying stunts the movies love to peddle. The real bread and butter of your Roman workout routine. Endurance, plain and simple. You're here to outlast, not outshine, and the training regimen is, unsurprisingly, a grueling testament to that ethos. Let's dive into a day in your sweaty sandals. You start off with a brisk jog. Not the kind that earns you a leisurely stroll through the park with a latte, but the kind that tests whether your heart's still in your chest. We're talking miles on end, because nothing says gladiator ready like cardio that makes you question your life choices. This isn't just about getting your steps in. It's about building the stamina to dodge, swipe, and occasionally run for your life when the lions have skipped breakfast. Next up, it's time to pump some iron, ancient style. Forget dumbbells and barbells. We're talking about hefting logs and lifting stones, the kind that makes CrossFit look like a warm-up. Your muscles are your armor, and those biceps aren't just for flexing in front of the mirror. They're for wielding weapons that weigh more than your average toddler. Don't expect any praise for those bulging arms, though. Your Lannister isn't interested in aesthetics. He's interested in durability. Once your arms are sufficiently jelly-like, it's time to spar. But this isn't the romanticized duel under the moonlight. It's sweaty, gritty, and often more about not getting whacked in the head than looking cool doing it. The veterans, those guys who have survived more fights than you can count, drill technique into you like your life depends on it. Because, spoiler alert, it kind of does. You're not just learning to swing a sword, you're learning to anticipate, parry, and counter. It's like chess, but with significantly higher stakes and fewer nerds. And then comes the ultimate test of endurance, the diet. If you thought gladiators dined on steak and wine like Roman senators, think again. Your meals are more akin to carbo-loading sessions than feasts fit for a king. The staple diet, barley and beans. Yes, you heard right. These aren't just budget-friendly. They're the ancient equivalent of protein shakes and energy bars. High in carbs and protein, they're designed to bulk you up and give you the energy to keep going round after round in the arena. Forget the abs. It's all about that layer of protective padding that turns a stabbing into a mere inconvenience. But let's talk numbers. Because as much as you'd love to think you're doing this for the glory, it's all about the economics. Remember, a gladiator's diet would set you back around 1,200 calories a day. A calorie count much less concerned with refined sugars and more with sheer survival. Your Lannister wants you alive, and feeding you is a strategic investment. Those beans and barley might not sound appetizing, but they keep you fueled and fighting fit. You're not just a combatant, you're a walking, sweating testament to the science of nutrition and ancient sports medicine. Now, about that Hollywood image. If you think gladiators were all lone wolves, think again. Teamwork is as essential as the weapons you wield. In the arena, your survival often hinges on the guy next to you, and there's no room for the prima donna routine. It's less Gladiator and more Rome's Got Talent, where knowing your role and playing it well can mean the difference between a standing ovation and a funeral procession. The instructors drill into you the art of working together, because a well-coordinated team is a lot harder to defeat than a bunch of solo acts looking for their own moment of glory. So, here you are, a cog in the grand machine of Roman entertainment, and while the crowd might bay for blood and the poets pen tales of your exploits, you're grounded in the gritty reality of the training grind. You're not just a warrior, you're an athlete, an economic asset, and a testament to the enduring appeal of spectacle over substance. And as you lace up those sandals and prepare for another day of sweat and toil, remember, it's not about how you die, but how you live long enough to fight another day. Stay tuned, because the story of your life in the Ludus is far from over. There's more to discover, and trust me, it's a tale as thrilling as any epic. Ah, the life of a Roman gladiator. It's not just a job, it's a lifestyle, complete with its own brand of celebrity status and social complexities. Now, let's peel back the layers on your social standing, a subject more tangled than a Roman toga at a toga party. Contrary to the Hollywood image of a gladiator as a universally adored hero or a doomed soul, the truth is a bit more nuanced. In Roman society, you could be both a superstar and a social pariah, depending on who's watching. Let's start with the basics. Gladiators came from all walks of life. Sure, a significant number were slaves, captured in battles or sold into servitude. But here's a plot twist. Some gladiators were volunteers. Yes, you heard it right. In a society where social mobility was harder than winning a chariot race with a flat tire, some free men willingly signed up for this life. Maybe they were drawn to the promise of glory or a payday that could rival a Roman senator's salary. Or perhaps they were just looking for an escape from the grind of mundane Roman life. The pay was decent, around 3,000 sesterces per fight, which could buy you a whole lot of garum. the Roman equivalent of ketchup. But let's not get carried away. Just because you were a volunteer didn't mean you were suddenly the toast of the town. Gladiators were a bit like modern-day celebrities, fascinating to the masses, but not exactly who you'd invite for tea with Grandma. You'd be admired for your bravery and skill, yet many still saw you as the lowest rung on the social ladder. It was a classic case of love the player, hate the game. As for your fan base, it was as diverse as a Roman forum on market day. The common folk loved you. After all, you were their Netflix, their blockbuster movie, their weekend entertainment wrapped up in one. They'd cheer for you in the arena, bet on your victories, and maybe, just maybe, whisper your name in the same breath as the guards. But don't let it go to your head. The Roman elites, on the other hand, had a different view. They might enjoy the spectacle, but they weren't about to rub elbows with a gladiator at the local bathhouse. And speaking of bathhouses, let's dive into the public relations machine that was ancient Rome. The myth of the glamorous gladiator wasn't just wishful thinking, it was a carefully crafted narrative, a PR spin that could make even today's spin doctors blush. Roman elites were experts in managing public perception, and the games were a tool for maintaining order. By elevating the status of gladiators, they distracted the masses from the less savory aspects of Roman life, like, rampant political corruption and economic disparity. This isn't to say gladiators didn't enjoy some perks. Successful ones could earn their freedom and retire with a nice little nest egg, assuming they survived long enough. Some even became trainers, turning their hard-won skills into a lucrative second act. And in rare cases, a particularly charismatic gladiator might catch the eye of a wealthy patron, or, dare I say, a member of the imperial family. But let's not get too carried away. These were exceptions, not the rule. Now, if you think the life of a gladiator was all about brawn and no brains, think again. It was a game of strategy, both inside and outside the arena. You had to navigate the complex social dynamics, understanding who held the real power and how to play to the crowd. In many ways, you were both a pawn and a player, a performer in a grand drama orchestrated by those far above your pay grade. But why, you might ask, did the Romans invest so much in this spectacle? It was more than just entertainment. It was about control. The games were a way to placate the masses, a distraction from the harsh realities of Roman life. Bread and circuses. The bread being the literal food provided to keep the populace from revolting, and the circuses being, well, you. Your life, your struggles, your victories and defeats were all part of a grand design to keep the wheels of Roman society turning smoothly. So, as you stand in the arena, soaking in the deafening roar of the crowd, remember this. You're not just a gladiator. You're a symbol, a tool, a means to an end. Your fighting skills, your endurance, your very life, are part of a spectacle that serves a purpose far greater than any individual fame or fortune. The Romans knew how to put on a show, and you, my friend, are center stage. And just like that, we find ourselves knee-deep in the paradox that is the life of a gladiator, celebrated yet marginalized, feared yet admired, a warrior and a performer all rolled into one. As the crowd's cheers echo in your ears and the sands of the arena become a stage, remember that this is just another day in the complex, contradictory existence of a Roman gladiator. And while the curtain may never truly fall on your story, there's always more to uncover about the fascinating world you inhabit. Stay tuned, because the saga of your life in the Ludus is far from over. As the sands of the arena settle and the cheers fade into the Roman sunset, let's step behind the scenes, where the real magic, or more accurately, the gritty grind, of gladiatorial life unfolds. Welcome to the unsung world of the Medici, the ancient equivalent of a sports medicine team without the fancy degrees and lab coats. These guys were the backstage heroes, the ones who patched up the warriors of the arena when things got a little too real. Now, don't go picturing a sterile hospital ward with beeping machines and gleaming scalpels. We're talking about a makeshift setup that relied more on instinct and trial and error than any Hippocratic oath. Yet, for all its rough edges, Roman medical care was surprisingly sophisticated. In fact, it was less about letting the fates decide who lived or died, and more about stacking the odds in your favor. Here's a jaw-dropper for you. Gladiators were given better medical attention than many Roman citizens. Why? Because, as we've already established, you were a walking asset. Your Lannister didn't want to see his investment bleed out on the sand. So, gladiator schools often had their own resident medici. These guys knew their way around a broken bone or a nasty gash, and they were worth their weight in sesterces. Forget about popping a painkiller and calling it a day. We're diving into a world where surgery was performed without anesthesia, and antiseptics were a twinkle in a future scientist's eye. Yet the Romans were no slouches. They utilized tools that wouldn't look out of place in a modern surgical kit: forceps, scalpels, and even catheters. And if that sounds surprisingly advanced, remember, necessity is the mother of invention, especially when a gladiator's career and your betting pool is on the line. Let's talk specifics. Got a nasty cut from that last bout. The medici might sprinkle some vinegar on it. It was considered a disinfectant of sorts. Sure, it stung like a betrayal, but it beat an infection that could have you checking out of the mortal coil early. And if things got really hairy, they might cauterize the wound with a hot iron. Not exactly spa treatment, but effective in a pinch. But it wasn't just about crisis management. Keeping a gladiator fighting fit was also about preventative care. You might find your medici prescribing a diet that included garlic and onions, nature's antibiotics, if you will. And let's not forget the herbal remedies. From willow bark to poppy seeds, these ancient darks were mixing up brews that'd make your local health food store look like child's play. And what about broken bones, you ask? Well, the Romans were the OGs of splinting and setting. They'd immobilize fractures with wooden splints and bandages, a technique that stood the test of time. And while they might not have had x-rays, they had something almost as good: experience. A veteran medici could probably set a bone with their eyes closed, though let's hope they didn't try. Now, let's debunk the myth of the gladiator as a one-and-done deal. The average gladiator could expect to fight several times a year, and given the investment in keeping them alive, they often had careers that spanned several years. Sure, they had the life expectancy of a modern-day pop star at their peak, but the medici were there to stretch that timeline as much as possible. But let's not get carried away with rose-tinted nostalgia. These were still brutal times, and for every success story, there were countless tragedies. The survival rate of gladiators might have been higher than you'd think, but death was always lurking just one misstep or miscalculation away. Here's where the economics come in. A skilled medici could earn a pretty penny, especially if they kept a stable of gladiators in fighting shape. We're talking about a salary that could rival a well-off merchant. This wasn't just a calling, it was a business, a lucrative one at that. The Lannister, always looking to protect his investment, would spare no expense on the best care money could buy. After all, a dead gladiator doesn't pay dividends. So, while the games were a spectacle of life and death, behind the scenes, it was all about defying the odds and prolonging careers. The medici were the unsung heroes of the ludus, fighting their own battles with infection and injury. And as the arena's sands drank the blood of countless battles, the medici toiled away, turning the tide in favor of survival more often than not. In this world, where life was both a commodity and a performance, the stakes were high, and the margins for error razor-thin. Yet, amidst the chaos, there was a method to the madness, a system that, despite its limitations, managed to sustain and even nurture life. So, as you stand under the Roman sky, ready for another day in the unpredictable theater of the games, remember that it's not just your sword that's sharp. It's the minds of those who keep you alive to fight another day. And with that, we leave the arena for now, the stories of the medici echoing in the corridors of history. But don't wander too far, because the saga of the gladiator is far from over. There's more to uncover, more myths to debunk, and more truths to tell. So stay tuned, because the next chapter in this epic tale is just around the corner, waiting to reveal its secrets. And just like that, dear listener, we find ourselves on the cusp of freedom, or at least the tantalizing possibility of it. For a gladiator, the promise of liberation wasn't just a fairy tale or a fleeting daydream. It was an attainable, albeit rare, reality, shimmering like a mirage across the blood-streaked sands of the arena. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This isn't the kind of freedom you win with a motivational poster and a catchy slogan. In the harsh world of Roman gladiators, freedom came in the form of a wooden sword, a rudis. Now, before you dismiss it as a useless splinter, this rudis was a symbol more potent than a golden ticket to Willy Wonka's factory. It marked a gladiator's graduation from the bloody grind of the arena to the relative safety of civilian life. You see, earning a Rudy's wasn't about slicing through opponents like you're in a Tarantino film. It was about endurance, skill, and a bit of luck. Win enough battles, survive enough seasons, and you might just earn your ticket out. But let's be real, the odds of that happening were about as favorable as winning the lottery while being struck by lightning. So, what happened to the lucky few who managed to clutch that wooden sword? Once freed, Gladiator could transition into roles like a trainer, using their hard-earned expertise to shape the next generation of arena warriors. Others might drift into mercenary work or bodyguard gigs, a lucrative option in a world where the political backstab was as common as a toga party. For some, their reputation as arena legends could even open doors to the upper echelons of society, although let's not pretend they were being handed the keys to the Roman Senate. Speaking of political backstabbing, let's peel back the layers on the political chess game that was the gladiatorial contests. These weren't just sports events, they were political theater at its finest. Imagine the games as the ancient equivalent of a campaign rally, where politicians sought to curry favor with the masses. The emperor himself, or a powerful senator, might sponsor games to gain popularity or distract the populace from political scandals and economic woes. Bread and circuses, remember. The bread kept you fed, and the circuses kept you entertained, and conveniently less likely to revolt. But here's where it gets juicy. The infamous thumbs up or thumbs down. Hollywood would have you believe that a thumbs down from the emperor meant instant doom for the defeated gladiator. Alas, historical records, those pesky little things, suggest otherwise. The Roman gesture of life or death was more likely a turn of the thumb, either towards the chest, for mercy, or away, for death. So next time you want to give a thumbs down to your least favorite movie, remember, you're not quite as historically accurate as you might think. Now, let's talk about the societal impact of freed gladiators. Contrary to the fairy tale ending, freedom didn't automatically translate to acceptance. Sure, they were no longer bound by the chains of servitude, but they carried the stigma of their past lives. In Roman society, once a gladiator, always a gladiator. Freedmen often faced prejudice and were pigeonholed into certain roles, much like athletes struggling to find their way after retiring from the limelight today. Yet, despite these challenges, the allure of the gladiator persists. Fast forward a couple of millennia, and you'll find that gladiators still loom large in our cultural consciousness. They are the subjects of movies, TV shows, and countless books, each one clinging to the romanticized image of the lone warrior against the odds. Sure, there's a healthy dose of fiction mixed in with historical reality, but hey, who doesn't love a good underdog story? But why, you might ask, do these ancient warriors continue to captivate us? Perhaps it's the timeless appeal of resilience in the face of adversity, a narrative as relevant today as it was in the Colosseum. Or maybe it's the spectacle, the drama, the larger-than-life characters who defied fate and fought for their lives under the scorching Roman sun. It's a potent cocktail of myth and reality, one that speaks to our deepest instincts and desires. In the end, the legacy of the gladiator is a testament to the enduring power of storytelling. We crave the drama, the stakes, and the triumph of the human spirit, elements that transcend time and culture. The gladiator, with all their flaws and fierceness, embodies something elemental about the human condition. They remind us of our own battles, our own quests for freedom, however those might manifest in our modern lives. So, as the sun sets on this chapter of Roman history, remember that the story of the gladiator isn't just about life and death in the arena. It's about survival, strategy, and the ever-present dance between myth and reality. It's a saga that continues to echo through the ages, reminding us that while the players may change, the game remains the same. And with that, dear listener, we close the book on our gladiatorial odyssey, a tale as complex and compelling as the history it sprang from. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never let the sands of time settle too deeply on the truth. Ever wonder what it was like to grow up in a family where your uncle was Genghis Khan? Well, welcome to Kublai Khan's childhood, where family reunions had a little more swordplay than your average picnic. Born in 1215 in the Mongol heartland, Kublai entered a world defined by vast, wind-swept steppes, horse-mounted warriors, and a fierce clan reputation that was less about gentle persuasion and more about, well, convincing arguments made with arrows. Now, Let's clear up one thing right off the bat. The Mongols weren't just about pillage and plunder. Sure, they knew how to throw a mean siege, but there was more to them than just the terror they inspired in the medieval world. The Khan family, Kublai included, were masters of strategy and diplomacy. It wasn't all about the battle axe. It was about knowing when to shake hands, even if the other hand was on the hilt of a sword. Kublai was the grandson of Genghis Khan, a name synonymous with fear and conquest, but also with a surprisingly modern understanding of empire building. Genghis had a knack for uniting disparate tribes under a single banner, turning squabbling nomads into an unstoppable force. By the time Kublai was born, the Mongol Empire was already a sprawling, multicultural behemoth. It stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, a whopping 9 million square miles. That's bigger than Australia. Growing up, Kublai had to navigate the tricky dynamics of Mongol politics, which made Game of Thrones look like a friendly game of tic-tac-toe. Family feuds were less past the potatoes and more past the poison chalice. Yet this was an environment where young Kublai thrived. His father, Tarlui, was Genghis Khan's youngest son and a key military leader, and his mother, Sorgatani Biki, was a Nestorian Christian princess known for her political savvy. Talk about a power couple. Sorgatani, in particular, was instrumental in shaping Kublai's understanding of governance. She taught him the importance of diplomacy and administration, skills that would serve him well in the future. Kublai's early education wasn't limited to horseback archery and the art of war. His mother ensured he learned about Chinese culture and administration, recognizing early on the value of these skills in ruling a diverse empire. This wasn't just a crash course in Confucianism. It was a strategic move in a game of political chess. Sorgatani's influence was so profound that even the famously ruthless Mongol court respected her counsel. But let's not get too starry-eyed about Mongol diplomacy. Yes, Kublai was learning the ropes of statecraft, but this was still a culture that made its mark with iron and blood. The Mongol Empire's reputation for brutality wasn't entirely unearned. Their networking events often involved invading cities, and their idea of a business merger was more surrender or die than let's discuss synergy. Yet even here, there's nuance. The Mongols were pragmatic conquerors. Cities that surrendered without a fight were often spared the full wrath of Mongol retribution, a practical incentive for cooperation that kept their empire ticking. As Kublai matured, he found himself caught between the old ways and new ideas. The Mongol Empire's reputation for brutality was a double-edged sword. Fear kept enemies in check, but it also fueled resistance. Kublai, with his exposure to different cultures, saw the benefits of a more diplomatic approach. This isn't to say he was a pacifist. He was more than capable of unleashing the Mongol horde when needed. But he was also a pragmatist, recognizing that sometimes a carrot worked better than a stick, especially if that carrot was backed by a very big stick. Now, about those family feuds. Mongol succession politics were, to put it mildly, a bit of a mess. Genghis Khan had laid down some rules, but like any good set of bylaws, they were open to interpretation. The result? A series of internecine conflicts that would give any soap opera a run for its money. Kublai had to deal with rival cousins and uncles, each with their own claims and ambitions. His elder brother Mernk's ascension to the role of Great Khan in 1251 was a turning point, giving Kublai the opportunity to prove his mettle as a leader. Mernk appointed Kublai as the governor of northern China, a position that enabled him to hone his administrative skills and lay the groundwork for his future rule. In this role, Kublai began to implement reforms that blended Mongol and Chinese practices, a testament to his ability to adapt and innovate. He worked to promote agriculture, stabilize the economy, and support local governance, a far cry from the stereotypical image of the Mongols as mere destroyers. This wasn't just altruism. It was a savvy move to bolster his power base and win the loyalty of his new subjects. Kublai's approach was an early indication of the kind of leader he would become, one who understood that an empire was more than just land and loot. It was people and prosperity. Kublai's early years are a fascinating study in contrasts. He was a product of his time, a warrior in a world of warriors, yet he was also a visionary who saw beyond the immediate horizon. The young Mongol prince was already showing signs of the qualities that would define his reign. a blend of martial prowess and political acumen, tempered by an understanding of the cultures he sought to rule. In the cutthroat world of Mongol politics, Kublai had to be both fox and lion, as Machiavelli would later put it. His ability to navigate the shifting sands of power while staying true to the legacy of his grandfather set the stage for his future as one of the most remarkable leaders in history. Each family feud, every political maneuver, was a lesson learned, a step taken on the path to greatness. And so, the stage was set for Kublai Khan to rise, poised to take the Mongol Empire to its zenith. As Kublai Khan stood on the precipice of power, he wasn't just inheriting a throne, he was stepping into a whirlwind of political chaos and economic opportunity. You see, Mongol Empire was at a crossroads. It needed a leader who could wield both a sword and a ledger. Enter Kublai, a man who wasn't afraid to gamble with the future, sometimes literally. Let's start with his bold move to introduce paper money. Imagine the scene, a room full of skeptical Mongol nobles staring at a stack of paper bills as if Kublai had just shown them magic beans. "You want us to trade these for actual goods?" they'd ask, incredulity etched on their faces. But Kublai, ever the visionary, saw what they couldn't. By 1260, the empire was sprawling, and lugging around bags of silver wasn't exactly convenient. His decision to implement paper currency wasn't just about economic convenience. It was a strategic play to centralize power and streamline trade across vast territories. Was Kublai a financial genius, or just a risk-taker with a flair for the dramatic? Well, the jury's still out. But consider this. The yuan-keo, as the paper money was called, was backed by the state, meaning it was only as valuable as the stability of Kublai's regime. Talk about high-stakes poker. Yet it worked, at least for a while. Traders were initially wary, but soon enough they realized the practical benefits. Who wouldn't prefer a wallet to a wagon train of coins? Of course, Kublai didn't stop at reinventing currency. He also knew that empires run on more than just cash, so he looked at taxes. Now, before you roll your eyes, thinking this sounds about as exciting as watching paint dry, remember, taxes can be spicy. Kublai offered tax incentives to farmers and artisans, encouraging them to boost production and innovation. This wasn't just a benevolent gesture. It was economic engineering at its finest. More production meant more goods for trade, which in turn meant more revenue for the empire's coffers. It was the medieval equivalent of a government stimulus package, minus the lengthy congressional debates. Here's the kicker. Kublai's tax policy wasn't just about filling the treasury. It was about winning hearts and minds. By promoting agriculture and supporting local economies, he was essentially saying, "Hey, I'm not just here to conquer you. I'm here to help you thrive." This approach was crucial for maintaining control over newly acquired territories, especially in China. After all, the Mongols had a rather, shall we say, aggressive reputation. Convincing people that they were better off under Mongol rule required more than just the threat of a cavalry charge. Speaking of which, let's talk about those yaks. How many does it take to conquer China? More than you'd think. The Mongol army was renowned for its mobility, able to cover up to 100 miles a day thanks to their sturdy steeds, and yes, an impressive number of yaks. These hairy beasts were the unsung heroes of the Mongol logistics chain, hauling everything from tents to supplies across vast distances. It turns out, if you want to conquer the world, you need good infrastructure, and yaks were the Ubers of their day. But Kublai wasn't just about logistical wizardry. He was also a master of cultural diplomacy. Let's not forget, this was a man who blended Mongol and Chinese administrative practices like a medieval DJ mixing tracks. By incorporating Confucian scholars into his government, he earned legitimacy in the eyes of the Chinese. It was a smart move, one that helped stabilize his rule in a region that had long resisted Mongol incursions. Kublai's rise to power wasn't a straight path, though. In 1264, he faced a civil war against his brother Eric Burke, who had his own designs on the throne. It was a classic case of sibling rivalry, Mongol style. The stakes, control of the largest empire the world had ever seen. The outcome, Kublai emerged victorious, but not without cost. The conflict strained resources and highlighted the fractures within the Mongol leadership, a harbinger of challenges to come. Despite the internal strife, Kublai's economic strategies laid the groundwork for what many historians consider the height of the Mongol Empire. His reign marked a period of prosperity, with thriving trade routes and bustling cities. The Silk Road flourished under his watch, becoming a superhighway of commerce and culture that connected the East and West like never before. Yet, as with any good story, there's always more to the tale. The successes of Kublai's policies also sowed the seeds for future challenges. The reliance on paper money, for instance, would later become a double-edged sword, as inflation reared its ugly head. Kublai Khan's story is one of contrasts and contradictions, a man who could be both ruthless and magnanimous, a warrior and a statesman, a traditionalist and an innovator. His rise to power was marked by strategic brilliance and audacious risk-taking, and as he solidified his rule, the Mongol Empire reached unprecedented heights. But remember, even at the zenith, the winds of change were already stirring on the horizon. As Kublai Khan looked out over his vast domain, he must have known that the real challenge was not just building an empire, it was keeping it together. As Kublai Khan gazed across his empire, he probably felt a mix of pride and trepidation, like a juggler who just added a flaming torch to his act. Because ruling the largest empire on earth wasn't just about keeping the peace, it was about crafting a narrative. And Kublai, with his love for art and culture, understood the power of a good story. Enter Xanadu, Kublai's summer capital, the place where legends were born and Coleridge's opium-fueled dreams took flight. Picture a sprawling palace complex set amidst lush gardens and expansive hunting grounds, a paradise straight out of a medieval Instagram post, if the app existed back then. Xanadu wasn't just an architectural marvel, it was a statement. It screamed sophistication and power, a blend of Mongolian and Chinese influences that aimed to impress both subjects and rivals. Now, let's debunk a few myths while we're here. Xanadu's opulence is often exaggerated, thanks to a certain British poet who never actually visited the site. But while it may not have been paved with gold, it was undoubtedly grand. Built in 1256, the city featured a palace of marble and gold, surrounded by walls that stretched over 16 miles. It was a place of leisure and governance, where Kublai entertained guests with lavish banquets and intricate ceremonies. Yet it also served as a political tool, showcasing a Mongol leader who could appreciate and appropriate the finer things in life. Kublai's love for the arts was genuine, but it was also pragmatic. He understood that culture was a bridge, not a barrier. By embracing Chinese traditions, he was essentially saying, "Look, I'm not some barbarian at the gate. I'm the ruler who appreciates your culture and heritage." This was a savvy move in a land where Mongol rule was still met with suspicion. He patronized artists and scholars, commissioning works that would glorify his reign and legitimize his rule. This wasn't just about personal taste, it was statecraft at its most elegant. But while Kublai was busy mixing cultures like a master chef, he faced a bureaucratic nightmare that could rival any modern-day government shutdown. You see, running an empire wasn't all poetry and painting. It was about administration, and that's where things got tricky. The Mongol Empire, vast and diverse, required a bureaucracy that could manage everything from tax collection to local governance. Kublai's solution: a blend of Mongol military governance with Chinese civil administration. Think of it as a political smoothie, combining the best of both worlds. However, this was easier said than done. Imagine trying to get two very different bureaucratic systems to play nice, like herding cats, only these cats had swords and a penchant for rebellion. Kublai's efforts to streamline governance often met with resistance, especially from traditional Mongol elites who weren't thrilled about adopting Chinese methods. It was a delicate dance, balancing innovation with tradition, and Kublai was the reluctant choreographer. To keep the empire running smoothly, Kublai needed skilled administrators. Enter the civil service exams, a Chinese institution that he adopted to ensure the selection of capable officials. This was revolutionary for the Mongols, who typically chose leaders based on loyalty and martial prowess. By implementing exams, Kublai was betting on meritocracy over nepotism, an idea that was both radical and risky. But it was also necessary if he wanted to maintain control over a sprawling empire where local knowledge and expertise were crucial. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about these changes. The Mongol aristocracy, accustomed to privileges and power, viewed Kublai's reforms with skepticism. They weren't keen on seeing their influence wane in favor of educated bureaucrats, many of whom were drawn from the Chinese elite. This tension simmered beneath the surface, a reminder that Kublai's attempts at cultural fusion were as much about survival as they were about vision. Yet, for all his administrative headaches, Kublai's reign marked a cultural renaissance. He welcomed foreign visitors, including the famous Venetian traveler Marco Polo, whose tales would captivate Europe and cement Kublai's legend in the West. Polo wasn't just a tourist. He was a witness to Kublai's vision, a world where East met West, where trade and culture flowed along the Silk Road like a river of possibilities. But let's not get too misty-eyed. Kublai's rule, while innovative, was also fraught with challenges. The introduction of paper money, remember those skeptical nobles, had its drawbacks. Inflation, a persistent thorn in Kublai's side, threatened to destabilize the economy. As more paper bills were printed, their value decreased, leading to economic turmoil that even the great Khan couldn't always control. In a way, Kublai was a man caught between worlds. He was a Mongol by birth, a Chinese emperor by necessity, and a Renaissance man by choice. His love for culture and art, his embrace of new ideas, and his relentless drive to innovate set him apart as a leader who defied easy categorization. Was he ahead of his time? In many ways, yes. But he was also a product of his era, a leader navigating the complexities of empire with a vision that was both bold and fraught with peril. As Kublai Khan continued to weave the tapestry of his reign, he left an indelible mark on history. His efforts to blend cultures, his passion for the arts, and his bureaucratic reforms reshaped the Mongol Empire, setting the stage for its zenith. Yet, like any good story, Kublai's tale was far from over. The challenges he faced were formidable, and the legacy he sought to build was a precarious one. As the winds of change swept across his empire, Kublai knew that the real test lay not in the heights he had reached, but in the strength of the foundations he had laid. Yet, Kublai Khan wasn't exactly resting on his laurels or reclining in a Xanadu recliner. Nope, he was busy grappling with one of history's greatest juggling acts, keeping a colossal empire intact across vast and varied territories. Picture this, a domain stretching over 12 million square miles, dotted with countless diverse cultures, languages, and a geography so varied it could make a cartographer weep. The logistics of ruling such a sprawl were nothing short of a medieval Rubik's Cube. First up, let's talk about the Mongolian postal system, aka the Pony Express on steroids. This wasn't just some quaint mail service. It was the empire's nervous system, a network of relay stations known as YAM, spread across thousands of miles. These stations, located about 25 miles apart, were stocked with fresh horses and provisions, allowing messengers to gallop across the empire at breakneck speeds. Think of it as FedEx with hooves, fast, efficient, and occasionally hilarious. Imagine a messenger arriving at a station, only to find the horses have wandered off. Oops, guess that urgent decree from Kublai will have to wait. But in all seriousness, this system was crucial. It wasn't just about delivering love letters or imperial decrees. It was about maintaining control. It allowed Kublai to keep his finger on the pulse of his empire, ensuring that orders were dispatched and obeyed with military precision. The speed and reliability of the YAM were legendary, with some reports suggesting that a message could be delivered from Beijing to the western borders faster than you could say Silk Road. This communication network was the empire's lifeline, helping Kublai manage everything from rebellions to tax collection. And speaking of taxes, there's no ignoring the economic context here. Kublai's empire was a mosaic of economies, each with its own quirks and currencies. Implementing a unified tax system was like trying to square a circle, especially when dealing with regions that were as different as chalk and cheese. Yet, Kublai's knack for pragmatism shone through. He adopted a flexible approach, allowing local customs to dictate tax collection methods. In practice, this meant letting people pay in whatever they had, be it silk, silver, or even livestock. The goal was simple: keep the empire's coffers full without sparking revolts. Now, let's not sugarcoat this. Governing such diverse peoples was an exercise in both diplomacy and occasional strong-arming. Kublai often found himself in a wrestling match with local elites who weren't exactly thrilled about being under Mongol rule. To win them over, he employed a mix of carrot and stick, rewarding loyalty with autonomy while quashing dissent with the full might of his military. This delicate balancing act was a testament to his political acumen, but it wasn't without its pitfalls. Enter Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant whose tales of Kublai's court would later spark European imaginations. According to Marco, Kublai's court was the epitome of opulence and sophistication, a vision of exotic luxury that had Westerners dreaming of silk robes and spicy noodles. But let's add a pinch of salt to this narrative. Polo's accounts, while captivating, were often embroidered with the kind of embellishments that would make a fisherman blush. Sure, Kublai's court was impressive, but not quite the magical wonderland Marco described. It was more a hub of strategic brilliance than a Disneyland of delights. Still, you can't entirely blame Marco for his starry-eyed tales. Kublai knew how to put on a show, using his court as a stage for political theater. Lavish banquets and grand ceremonies were tools of statecraft, designed to project power and stability. It was all about optics, showing allies and adversaries alike that the great Khan was as formidable as he was cultured. In a world where appearances mattered, Kublai was the master of the grand gesture, a leader who understood that sometimes perception was as important as reality. Yet, for all his successes, Kublai couldn't escape the inherent challenges of ruling a multi-ethnic empire. The sheer diversity of his subjects, ranging from Mongols to Chinese, Persians to Russians, meant that governance was often a game of whack-a-mole, with problems popping up faster than they could be solved. Cultural tensions simmered beneath the surface, and attempts to impose Mongol authority often met with resistance. In China, for instance, Kublai's attempts to integrate Mongol and Chinese governance faced skepticism from both sides. The Chinese elite, steeped in centuries of Confucian tradition, were wary of Mongol innovations, while the Mongols bristled at adopting what they saw as foreign customs. It was a bureaucratic tug-of-war, with Kublai as the referee trying to keep everyone playing by the same rules. Despite these challenges, Kublai's reign marked a period of unprecedented cultural exchange. The Silk Road, that fabled artery of trade and culture, thrived under his watch, facilitating the flow of goods, ideas, and people between East and West. This wasn't just commerce. It was a cultural symphony, a blending of influences that enriched both ends of the trade route. Kublai's empire was a melting pot, a place where Persian astronomers rubbed shoulders with Chinese engineers, and Venetian travelers like Marco Polo could find themselves at home. Yet, the very forces that drove this cultural renaissance also sowed the seeds of future challenges. The reliance on paper money, while innovative, eventually led to economic instability. Inflation became a persistent issue, eroding public confidence in Kublai's monetary system. Meanwhile, the empire's sheer size made it difficult to manage effectively, with outlying regions often operating with a degree of autonomy that bordered on independence. As Kublai Khan navigated these turbulent waters, he must have known that the true test of his leadership lay not in the empire's expansion, but in its cohesion. His ability to hold it all together, to keep the diverse tapestry of his realm from unraveling, was both his greatest challenge and his most enduring legacy. The empire he built was a testament to his vision and tenacity, a reflection of a leader who dared to dream big and act boldly. Yet, like any empire, the Mongol dominion under Kublai was a complex beast, a blend of ambition and pragmatism, innovation and tradition. It was a realm where the past and future collided, where the dreams of one man shaped the destiny of millions. As Kublai Khan continued to steer his empire through the storms of history, he left an indelible mark, a legacy of both triumph and turmoil, a reminder that even the greatest of empires are but temporary custodians of time. So, as we pause on this chapter of Kublai Khan's story, remember that while the glamour and grandeur of his reign dazzled many, the realities were as intricate as the finest Mongol tapestry. There's more to come in this epic saga, more tales of triumph and challenge, of power and peril, as Kublai's empire continued to navigate the shifting sands of history. Stay tuned, because the great Khan's story is far from over, and the best, or perhaps the worst, may be yet to come. As we dive into the final act of Kublai Khan's epic saga, it's time to peel back the layers of myth and reveal the man behind the legend, the emperor who ruled like a chess master but faced the ultimate checkmate. While Kublai's empire was a marvel to behold, it was also a bit like a Jenga tower built on shifting sands. And as we know, gravity has a way of reminding us who's boss. Kublai's legacy is a study in contrasts. On one hand, he was the visionary who bridged east and west, a cultural diplomat who knew the value of a well-placed Confucian scholar. His policies turned the Mongol Empire into a global powerhouse, a medieval version of Silicon Valley, but with more yaks. On the flip side, the very innovations that propelled his empire were also its Achilles heel. Paper money, initially a stroke of genius, eventually became a Pandora's box of inflation and economic woe. By the late 13th century, the currency was worth less than the paper it was printed on, leaving merchants grumbling louder than a hungry Mongol warrior. But it wasn't just economic hiccups that rattled Kublai's empire. Politically, the great Khan faced turbulence that would make any seasoned leader clutch their ceremonial robes. The Mongol system of succession was less a smooth transition and more a game of musical thrones. When Kublai passed away in 1294, he left a power vacuum that his successors struggled to fill. His chosen heir, Temur Khan, found himself in a snake pit of rival factions and rebellious princes. The bickering and backstabbing were so intense, you'd think they were auditioning for a medieval soap opera. And let's not forget the logistical nightmare of managing an empire that spanned continents. Sure, the Yam postal system was a marvel, but even the swiftest messenger couldn't outrun the tyranny of distance. The empire was like a massive corporation with too many regional offices and not enough middle managers, communication delays, and local autonomy bred inefficiencies that would make a modern CEO break out in a cold sweat. It's no wonder that, as the empire stretched its borders, its grip loosened. Despite these challenges, Kublai's reign left an indelible mark on history. His embrace of cultural fusion was revolutionary, creating a tapestry of innovation that would resonate through the ages. The Silk Road became a bustling artery of exchange, bringing spices, silk, and stories to eager merchants. This cultural cross-pollination was akin to a medieval internet, connecting diverse peoples in a web of shared knowledge and commerce. Yet Kublai's grand vision was not without its detractors. Some contemporaries saw his integration policies as a betrayal of Mongol traditions. They grumbled that the great Khan had gone native, swapping the saddle for the scholar's scroll. But Kublai understood that cultural adaptation was not a weakness, it was a strategy for survival. He was a pragmatist at heart, a leader who knew that the best way to rule a diverse realm was to embrace its diversity. As for the myth surrounding Kublai's death, let's clear the air. Legend has it he died in a blaze of glory, a warrior's end befitting his status. The reality, far less cinematic. Kublai passed away quietly at the age of 78, succumbing to the ailments of age, and perhaps a bit too much indulgence in rich foods. No dramatic last stand, no epic showdown, just the end of a remarkable life. Yet even in death, his influence lingered, a testament to the empire he had crafted with both sword and pen. Kublai's story reminds us that empires, like great stories, are ephemeral. His Mongol empire, once an unstoppable force, gradually fractured under the weight of its own ambitions. By the mid-14th century, the empire had splintered into independent khanates, each charting its own course. The Yuan dynasty in China, Kublai's crowning achievement, eventually fell in 1368, replaced by the Ming dynasty. The fall was less an apocalyptic collapse and more a gradual fading, like a sunset slipping beneath the horizon. So, was the empire's decline due to hubris, logistics, or the inevitable wear and tear of an overextended domain? The answer, like history itself, is complex. Kublai's ambition was both his greatest strength and his ultimate undoing. His vision transformed the medieval world, but it also sowed the seeds of fragmentation. The Mongol Empire was a grand experiment in multicultural governance, a testament to human ingenuity and the limits of power. In the end, Kublai Khan's legacy is one of paradoxes, a leader who wielded both carrot and stick, a conqueror who cherished culture, a ruler whose dreams outpaced the realities of empire. His story is a reminder that history's greatest figures are not defined by their victories alone, but by the indelible marks they leave on the world. As we close the book on Kublai's reign, we see a leader who dared to dream big, whose vision stretched beyond the horizon, and whose legacy continues to echo through the corridors of time. And so, as the curtain falls, we find ourselves not at the end, but back at the beginning, ready to explore the enduring impact of one man's dream on the tapestry of history. The Plantagenet family dinners must have been quite the spectacle. You could almost hear the clinking of goblets as they passed the venison and side-eyed each other across the table. In the midst of it all was young John, the eventual King John of England, who was probably more accustomed to being called Lackland than any regal title. Lackland, you ask? Yes, indeed. When you've got 3 older brothers who are charming their way across Europe, your inheritance looks a lot like the leftovers from last week's feast. So, let's dive into the medieval soap opera that was John's upbringing, where sibling rivalries weren't just for bragging rights, they were for entire kingdoms. John was born on Christmas Eve in 1166, the youngest of 5 sons to King Henry Roman II and Elena of Aquitaine, a power couple if there ever was one. Picture Henry Roman II, a man who controlled more territory in France than the French king himself, and Elena, the queen with a past marriage to the King of France under her belt. This was a family where ambition ran thicker than the blood in their veins, and John was the youngest cub scrambling for attention in a den full of lions. His brothers, Henry the young king, Richard the Lionheart, and Geoffrey, were practically medieval rock stars, each with a title and land to their name. John, on the other hand, wasn't even given a plot of dirt to call his own, hence the nickname Lackland. Now, if you're feeling sorry for little John, thinking he was just an overlooked footnote in the Plantagenet saga, hold that thought. John may have started as the spare, but he had the kind of determination that would make a bulldog look like a house cat. Despite his lack of land, John was his father's favorite. Henry Roman II reportedly saw a bit of himself in John, a cunning mind and a knack for survival. Ah, the complex dance of medieval favoritism. Henry even went so far as to promise John a hefty inheritance, including castles and titles, which naturally irked his brothers. Family gatherings must have been a hoot, with everyone keeping one hand on their goblet and the other on their dagger. The Plantagenet household wasn't just about familial skirmishes. It was an economic powerhouse and a financial sinkhole all in one. Running a royal household in the 12th century was no small feat. Picture the costs of maintaining castles, armies, and the constant parade of courtiers. The Plantagenets were practically the medieval equivalent of an empire, with territory stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. The logistics of managing such a vast domain would make any modern CEO break out in a cold sweat. Every move required funding, and money was often as elusive as a unicorn in a forest. But back to John. His rise to power wasn't exactly linear, thanks to the ever-entertaining game of medieval musical thrones. When Henry the young king died of dysentery in 1183, Richard and Geoffrey were still in line, and John was stuck playing the long game. Geoffrey, always the diplomat, managed to create a bit of chaos by dying in a tournament accident in 1186, leaving Richard as the heir apparent. John was still waiting in the wings, perhaps sharpening his skills in patience and cunning. Fast forward to 1189, and Richard the Lionheart ascends the throne. You'd think this would send John into a tailspin of despair, but quite the opposite. Richard, ever the adventurer, decided that the Holy Land needed his attention more than England did. While Richard was off crusading, John saw his chance to shine, or at least to try on the crown for size. Richard may have been the lion, but John was the fox, and with his brother away, he began to scheme his way into power. It was like the medieval version of Home Alone, with John setting up political traps instead of toy cars. During Richard's absence, John tried his hand at ruling, but his methods were about as subtle as a jousting lance. His attempts to seize the crown were thwarted when Richard returned in 1194, but John had already shown he was more than just the spare. He was a contender. Richard's reign was relatively short, and in 1199, when Richard died from an infected arrow wound, after all, even the bravest lion can fall, John finally got his chance, was crowned King of England, proving that sometimes the tortoise does beat the hare, especially when the hare gets distracted by holy wars. So, John Lackland became King John, but the nickname stuck around as a reminder of his rocky start. His reign was fraught with challenges, not least of which was the formidable task of keeping up with the Plantagenet legacy. The economics of maintaining a kingdom were no joke. The cost of royal life was a constant drain on the treasury, with the expense of hosting feasts, maintaining castles, and funding military campaigns looming large. Money, or the lack thereof, was a persistent thorn in John's side, and he had to find creative ways to fill the royal coffers. John's early years were a masterclass in survival and ambition, the prelude to a reign that would be marked by conflict, controversy, and a certain document that would change the course of history. But that's a tale for another day. For now, let's leave young John at the cusp of his kingship, ready to take on the world with a crown that was hard-won and a legacy that was anything but guaranteed. As they say, the rest is history, though with John, history was rarely straightforward, often messy, and always fascinating. Here we go, diving headfirst into the tangled web that was King John's reign. If you thought his path to the throne was a roller coaster, buckle up, because his time as king was more like a medieval soap opera with a tragicomic twist. John had barely warmed the throne when he found himself knee-deep in a series of blunders that would make even the most seasoned politician wince. Let's talk about Normandy, shall we? Normandy wasn't just any old piece of land. It was part of the Plantagenet heartland, and losing it was like misplacing your car keys, if your car keys were made of solid gold and had diplomatic implications. In 1204, John managed to lose Normandy to the French king, Philip Roman II, after a series of military missteps that would make a chess novice look like a grandmaster. This was the medieval equivalent of fumbling the family jewels, and it didn't exactly endear him to the English nobility. Losing Normandy wasn't just a geographical bungle, it was an economic disaster. The loss severed a critical trade route and emptied John's coffers faster than you could say bad investment. John's military campaigns were a bit like a Shakespearean tragedy, heavy on the drama, light on the happy endings. His attempts to regain lost territories were marred by poor planning and even poorer execution. In 1214, he faced a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Bouvines, which left his reputation in tatters and his treasury in dire straits. If John had been a novelist, his works would have been filed under How Not to Wage War. But let's not pin all of John's woes on his military escapades. His domestic policies were equally, if not more, infamous. Picture this: a tax scheme so sophisticated it would make a modern accountant raise an eyebrow. Needing funds to fuel his endless wars and maintain the royal lifestyle, John turned to taxing his subjects with a zeal that would give Scrooge a run for his money. The infamous scutage tax, essentially paying to avoid military service, became his go-to-revenue stream. It was a brilliant plan, if by brilliant you mean infuriating for the barons who had to foot the bill. John's tax policies became a breeding ground for resentment among the nobility. The barons were less than thrilled to bankroll his military failures, and this discontent simmered like a part of medieval stew left unattended. It's no wonder they eventually revolted, leading to that little document we all know and love, the Magna Carta. But let's not jump ahead just yet. There's more to John's story before the barons had their say. The moniker, Bad King John, didn't materialize out of thin air, but it's not all doom and gloom. Sure, he was a bit of a tyrant, but let's not forget that many of his so-called bad deeds were par for the course in medieval kingship. Power was a precarious thing, and John was playing a high-stakes game of survival. His reputation, tarnished by chroniclers with axes to grind, was perhaps more a product of the times than his inherent villainy. John's rule was a balancing act between keeping the crown on his head and keeping his barons from calling for his. He was a king in an era where loyalty was as stable as a castle made of sand. The barons weren't just disgruntled taxpayers. They were power players in their own right, and John's misadventures gave them plenty of fodder for rebellion. His reign was a masterclass in how not to win friends and influence people, yet it set the stage for profound change. Economically, John was in constant crisis management mode. The treasury was perpetually in the red, and his financial acrobatics were about as graceful as a medieval jester on a bad day. His frequent demands for money only widened the rift between him and his nobles, making his popularity ratings plunge faster than a leaden drawbridge. The more John taxed, the more his subjects squirmed, and the less likely they were to support his military ambitions. So, what about the myths? Was John truly the villain history paints him as? The truth lies somewhere between the legends and the ledger books. He was undoubtedly flawed, perhaps more a victim of circumstance than an outright tyrant. His failures were both personal and systemic, products of a time when kingship was as much about dodging daggers as it was about wearing crowns. As John's story unfolds, remember that history is rarely black and white. The so-called bad king was a complex figure navigating a landscape as treacherous as any battlefield. Sure, he was no Richard the Lionheart, but then, who really is? Richard was the medieval equivalent of a rock star, while John was more of a struggling artist trying to find his place in a cutthroat world. John's misadventures, from lost lands to tax upheavals, were the building blocks of baronial discontent, the very kindling that would ignite the flames of rebellion. But let's leave that for next time, as we delve deeper into the machinations that led to the Magna Carta, document that would echo through the ages, reshaping the monarchy and laying the groundwork for modern democracy. Now, as we leave John amidst his tangled web of political intrigue, remember that while he may have been the butt of many a medieval joke, his legacy is no laughing matter. His reign, for all its faults, is a testament to the enduring power of history to surprise, confound, and ultimately illuminate. Stay tuned, because the story of King John is far from over, and the best, or worst, is yet to come. And so, we find ourselves at the brink of one of history's most famous political showdowns, with King John as the unwitting star of the medieval reality show no one asked for. As tension simmered, the English barons were about as thrilled with John's leadership as a cat in a bathtub. John had managed to alienate practically everyone with a pulse, from his nobles to the clergy. By 1250, the kingdom was teetering on the edge of chaos, and the barons, fed up with John's tax first, ask questions never approach, were ready to take matters into their own gauntleted hands. Let's set the scene. England was a pressure cooker of discontent, and the barons were the steam threatening to blow the lid clean off. These weren't just any disgruntled lords. They were the medieval equivalent of the upper management, tired of a CEO who couldn't balance the books. Their grievances weren't just about high taxes, though that was a big chunk of it. They wanted a say in how the kingdom was run, a revolutionary idea that would have monarchs everywhere clutching their crowns in horror. In a move that would make any modern protest look like a picnic, the barons marched to London, effectively taking the city without so much as a sword fight. Talk about a power move. With London under their control, they were ready to confront John and demand what they believed was rightfully theirs, a say in the governance of the realm. It was a medieval standoff, and John, ever the wily antagonist, knew he had to play his cards right, or risk losing the whole deck. Cue the negotiations at Runnymede, a meadow that would soon become as famous as any battlefield. Picture this: June 1215, a grassy expanse by the River Thames, King John and his barons assembling for what was essentially a medieval board meeting. If you're imagining a scene of high drama with knights clashing swords, think again. The reality was more a mix of tense negotiations and not-so-subtle threats. John, caught between a rock and a hard place, had little choice but to engage with the barons' demands. And so, the stage was set for the creation of the Magna Carta, the document that's arguably more famous than its signatories. But let's peel back the layers of this legendary charter. The Magna Carta wasn't just a spontaneous love letter to democracy. It was a list of grievances that read more like a medieval Yelp review than a constitutional document. There were 63 clauses, each addressing specific baronial complaints. It wasn't about lofty ideals. It was about practical, immediate concerns. For example, Clause 12 stated that the king couldn't levy taxes without the baron's consent. In today's terms, it was like telling your landlord he couldn't raise the rent without a house meeting. Other clauses tackled issues like inheritance rights and protection from unlawful imprisonment. Clause 39, which declared that no free man could be imprisoned or stripped of rights without due process, was a nod to the legal protections we hold dear today. These weren't just arbitrary demands. They were about ensuring that the king couldn't run roughshod over his subjects. It was less about idealism and more about survival in a kingdom where whims often trumped laws. As negotiations unfolded, John must have felt like he was playing a game of chess where the barons had all the rooks. His options were limited, and the pressure was on. It wasn't just his crown at stake. It was his legacy. The barons, for their part, weren't exactly asking for democracy as we know it. They were more interested in protecting their own interests than in establishing a government by the people, for the people. Yet in the process, they laid the groundwork for something much bigger than themselves. The chaotic scenes at Runnymede were a mix of diplomacy and desperation. Imagine the tension in the air, with barons eyeing John like hawks, ready to pounce on any sign of weakness. This was high-stakes poker with swords, and everyone knew the cost of losing. The Magna Carta was sealed on June 15, 1215, not with a grand flourish, but with a pragmatic nod to reality. It wasn't a moment of triumph. It was a begrudging compromise, a ceasefire in a war that neither side could afford to lose. John's agreement to the Magna Carta was less about embracing a new political order and more about buying time. He had no intention of sticking to the terms, and within months he was back to his old tricks, trying to nullify the charter with papal support. It was a classic case of sign now, ignore later, but the barons weren't having it. The ink was barely dry before both sides were back at each other's throats, and civil war loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. Yet, despite John's best efforts to wriggle out of the agreement, the Magna Carta's impact was far from fleeting. It was reissued, revised, and reaffirmed over the years, embedding itself in the legal DNA of England and beyond. The irony was as thick as a castle wall. A document born out of self-interest and strife became a symbol of liberty and justice. Talk about an unintended legacy. So, as the dust settled on Runnymede, John found himself in a precarious position, his authority shaken but not shattered. The Magna Carta was a thorn in his side, a reminder that even kings weren't above the law, or at least not always. Yet the story was far from over. John's reign continued to unravel, and the seeds of rebellion he'd sown would soon sprout into a full-blown crisis. As we leave the meadow and the political theatre behind, remember that the Magna Carta was both a product of its time and a beacon for the future. It was a reminder that power, unchecked, is a dangerous thing, and that even in the darkest of times, the spark of change can ignite. But John's tale isn't finished yet. There's more drama, more intrigue, and more lessons in history's crucible. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the life and times of a king who, despite his flaws, left an indelible mark on the world. And so, with the Magna Carta ink barely dry and King John already plotting its undoing, you'd think the barons would get a breather. Spoiler alert, they didn't. John, being the medieval Houdini of bad ideas, had zero intention of honoring his pledge. Instead, he turned to Pope Innocent Roman III for a bit of divine intervention. Because when you're a king in a pickle, why not call in celestial backup? The Pope, seeing an opportunity to flex his own muscles, declared the Magna Carta null and void in August 1215. He labelled it as a shameless affront to royal authority, like a medieval cease and desist letter. For John, this papal bull was a get-out-of-jail-free card, but for the barons, it was more like a slap in the face with a mailed gauntlet. Now, you might expect that such ecclesiastical manoeuvring would calm the waters. Instead, it was like adding gunpowder to a bonfire. The barons were livid, and London was buzzing with rebellion as if someone had announced free mead at the Tavern. The annulment was the final straw, and soon enough swords were drawn as the kingdom descended into the First Barons' War, a medieval sequel that no one wanted but everyone got. This wasn't just a spat over legal fine print. It was a full-blown conflict, with castles changing hands like medieval airborne listings, and loyalties as reliable as an English summer. The war kicked off in earnest by late 1215, with John scrambling to hold his kingdom together like a quilt of mismatched patches. His tactics were as subtle as a battering ram, employing a mix of bribery, coercion, and sheer force to bring rebellious nobles to heel. But here's the kicker. John wasn't entirely without supporters. The Royalists, a faction loyal to the crown, rallied behind him, bolstered by promises of land and wealth, or at least what remained after his earlier fiscal blunders. Meanwhile, the rebel barons, feeling the sting of papal betrayal, turned to an unlikely ally, Prince Louis of France, inviting him to take the English crown. Yes, you heard right. They essentially outsourced their monarchy. Louis, sensing a golden opportunity to stick it to the Plantagenets, landed in England in 1216. He was greeted not with a cold shoulder, but with an open-armed welcome from the barons. For John, It was akin to having your neighbors invite a rival to dinner at your own table. With Louis in the mix, the war escalated, transforming from a familial feud to an international incident. Amidst the chaos, John was a whirlwind of activity, racing from one stronghold to another like a medieval firefighter trying to douse flames with a leaky bucket. His efforts to regain control were met with mixed success, as his forces experienced both victory and defeat. Yet, as if the universe had a twisted sense of humor, fate dealt John a hand he couldn't play. In October 1216, while retreating from a failed campaign in East Anglia, John contracted dysentery, a common enough medieval malady, but no less fatal. John's demise at Newark Castle was as ignoble as his reputation. The king who couldn't hold onto his lands, or loyalty now couldn't hold onto life. His death marked a turning point, leaving the throne to his 9-year-old son, Henry Roman III. Talk about passing the torch, or in this case, the crown to the next generation. In the aftermath, the barons, perhaps realizing they'd overplayed their hand with Louis, began to rethink their alliances. The death of John opened the door for reconciliation. The young Henry, being a minor, was less threatening, and his regents managed to broker peace by reissuing a revised Magna Carta in 1216, omitting some of the more contentious clauses. It was a classic case of, let's pretend we agree for now, buying time for the kingdom to heal. Yet, even after John's death, his reputation was a tangled mess of myth and reality. Enter the medieval spin doctors, historical chroniclers who wielded quills like swords, crafting tales that were less historical record and more PR campaign. Monks like Matthew Paris painted John as a tyrant, a king so vile that even his defeat seemed like divine justice. But were these accounts entirely fair? Or were they steeped in the same biases and agendas that color any tale of power and politics? John's story, after all, wasn't just about one man's failings. It was a reflection of a turbulent era, where the lines between hero and villain blurred like ink on a wet manuscript. His reign might have been a cautionary tale, but it was also a reminder of the complexities of leadership, a mix of strategy, serendipity, and sheer stubbornness. As we pause to catch our breath in this whirlwind of medieval drama, remember that history isn't just a series of dates and battles. It's a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, conflict, and compromise. John's legacy, for better or worse, was a testament to the enduring struggle between authority and accountability, a struggle that echoes through time. And while his reign ended in chaos, the Magna Carta's spirit lived on, a beacon in the often murky waters of governance. Stay tuned, because the saga of the Plantagenets is far from finished, with new players stepping onto the stage and old conflicts simmering beneath the surface. As ever, history's lessons are both a warning and a guide, urging us to look beyond the myths and seek the truths that lie beneath. And so, as the Plantagenet drama unfolded like a medieval soap opera, John's passing wasn't just the end of a chaotic reign, but the birth of a legacy that would unfurl over centuries. The Magna Carta, that scrap of parchment reluctantly sealed at Runnymede, was about to embark on a journey from medieval grievance list to the cornerstone of constitutional governance. Ironically, the very document meant to curb John's excesses became the bedrock of democracy. I mean, talk about turning lemons into lemonade, or, in John's case, turning a royal headache into a historical triumph. Fast forward a few decades, and the Magna Carta found itself reissued in 1225, this time with a royal seal of approval from John's son, Henry Roman III. It was like the sequel that actually surpassed the original, shedding some of the more contentious clauses, but retaining the core ideas that resonated through the ages. The principle that no one, not even a king, was above the law was like a beacon in the murky political landscape of the time. It was the medieval equivalent of installing a speed camera on the highway of royal power. A deterrent, not a panacea, but better than nothing. But let's get real for a second. The Magna Carta wasn't some altruistic manifesto. It was a product of its times, a pragmatic response to a king who had pushed his luck too far. The barons weren't exactly freedom fighters. They were more concerned with their own privileges than the rights of commoners. Yet the enduring appeal of the Magna Carta lies in its transformation from a baronial wish list to a symbol of liberty. It's like when a garage band's rough demo tape becomes a platinum record, unexpected but somehow fitting. Now, let's talk numbers. By the 14th century, Magna Carta had been reaffirmed over 40 times. It was the medieval equivalent of software updates, each version refining and reinforcing its place in the legal framework. Its clauses inspired the development of common law, laying the groundwork for legal principles that are still revered today. And while it didn't spell out democracy as we know it, it planted the seeds of parliamentary evolution. The idea that the ruler should consult his subjects before making decisions was revolutionary, an early nod to the notion of representation. As we leap through the centuries, the Magna Carta's influence only grew. It wasn't just a relic of English history, it became an international icon. In the 17th century, it was cited by Sir Edward Coke during his battles against the divine right of kings. He argued that the Magna Carta was a testament to the ancient rights of Englishmen, standing firm against royal tyranny. It was like a medieval mic drop, reminding monarchs that autocracy had its limits. And across the Atlantic, the Magna Carta became a touchstone for the American colonists. When they drafted their own Declaration of Independence in 1776, they echoed its principles, demanding representation and the rule of law. The Magna Carta's spirit was alive and well in the hearts of those seeking freedom from British rule. It was as if John's missteps had sowed the seeds for a global movement, catalyzing a shift towards the governance models we recognize today. Yet, for all its legendary status, the Magna Carta wasn't without its critics. Some historians argue it's been romanticized, its historical impact overstated. After all, its immediate effects were limited, and it didn't prevent future kings from overstepping their bounds. It was more a symbolic victory than a practical one, at least in the short term. But symbols have power, and the Magna Carta's real legacy was its ability to inspire generations to challenge authority and demand accountability. And what of King John, the man whose reign inadvertently sparked this constitutional revolution? History hasn't been kind to him, often casting him as the villain in tales of Robin Hood, the greedy tyrant who taxed the poor into oblivion. He's the medieval bogeyman, the poster child for bad kingship. But perhaps that's a bit unfair. Sure, John was no saint. His reign was marked by failures and follies, but he was also a product of his environment. A king navigating the treacherous waters of medieval politics, where loyalty was fickle and power was a double-edged sword. John's story is a reminder that history is rarely black and white. His legacy is a complex tapestry woven with threads of ambition, failure, and unintended consequences. While he may not have been the hero of his own narrative, he played a pivotal role in shaping a document that would outlive him by centuries. His reign, though fraught with missteps, set the stage for a new era of governance, where even the most powerful had to answer to the law. So, as we wrap up this whirlwind tour of King John's life and the Magna Carta's legacy, let's give a nod to the unexpected twists of history. The journey from a meadow in Runnymede to the halls of modern democracy is a testament to the enduring power of ideas. It's a story of how a king's misadventures paved the way for a movement that still echoes through the corridors of power today. And while John's tale might not have the fairy tale ending of a Disney movie, it's a story worth telling. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, the seeds of change can take root, growing into something far greater than their origins. As we close the book on King John and his infamous charter, let's remember that history, with all its complexities and contradictions, continues to shape our world in ways both seen and unseen. Now, isn't that a legacy worth pondering? In the early 1400, England wasn't exactly the wonderland of chivalry and glory that Shakespeare might have you believe, especially for a young prince growing up in the chaos of medieval politics. Meet Prince Hal, later known by his more regal title, King Henry V. His early days were less about noble deeds and more about dodging trouble and navigating the murky waters of royal expectations. Born in 1386 or 1387, historians can't seem to agree on the exact year. Hal was the eldest son of Henry Bolingbroke, who would later become King Henry Roman IV. Hal's childhood was a whirlwind of political turbulence and familial drama, a far cry from the legendary Band of Brothers vibe he'd later cultivate. Hal grew up during the reign of Richard Roman II, a king whose popularity could be generously described as on the rocks. In 1399, Hal's dad, Henry Bolingbroke, decided he'd had enough of Richard's antics and staged a coup, seizing the throne for himself. Young Hal went from being just another noble kid to the heir apparent overnight. Quite the upgrade, right? But here's the kicker. Being a prince wasn't just about fancy banquets and jousting tournaments. It meant living in a politically charged pressure cooker where the stakes were high, and the wrong move could get you exiled, or worse. As a teenager, Hal was sent to Wales to quell the rebellion led by Owain Glyndwr. This was basically the medieval equivalent of a grueling internship, except instead of fetching coffee, he was fending off Welsh arrows. There, he learned the gritty realities of warfare and leadership, skills that would later prove crucial. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. What about those famed tavern antics? Did he really hang out in pubs with a crew of merry misfits, like Shakespeare suggests in Henry Roman IV? The bard paints a picture of Hal as a fun-loving rogue, a kind of medieval frat boy who just needed a wake-up call to get his act together. The truth, a bit more complex. While it's true Hal wasn't averse to the occasional revelry, the idea that he spent his youth entirely in the company of raucous tavern-goers is likely more myth than reality. Shakespeare needed drama, after all. In reality, Hal was a politically astute young man, well aware of his position and the responsibilities it entailed. He had his share of youthful indiscretions, sure, but he was also deeply involved in the administration and military campaigns from a young age. So, while he might have enjoyed a drink now and then, he wasn't exactly a medieval party animal. His relationship with his father, King Henry Roman IV, was complicated. Henry Roman IV struggled with health issues and constant political strife, which didn't make for a warm and fuzzy father-son dynamic. Hal had to prove himself not just a worthy heir, but also someone who could handle the kingdom's problems, which were plentiful. England was embroiled in conflicts both at home and abroad, and the royal coffers were often running on empty. The economy was a mess, with the cost of military campaigns draining resources faster than you can say tax hike. As England's future king, Hal learned early on that managing a kingdom was less about gallant speeches and more about the gritty details of governance. It was about balancing the books and keeping the nobility in check, all while ensuring that the French didn't decide to pop over for an unscheduled invasion. The political climate was a minefield, with alliances shifting like the wind and every decision carrying the weight of potential disaster. Henry Roman IV reign was plagued by rebellions and conspiracies, with everyone from the French to the Scots taking their turn at causing trouble. Hal was thrust into this world of intrigue and danger, a baptism by fire that left little room for the carefree adolescence Shakespeare so fondly imagined. The young prince had to learn to navigate these treacherous waters, understanding that his actions, every last one, were scrutinized by those who would see him fail. Despite the tumultuous relationship with his father, Hal proved himself a capable leader in his own right. He distinguished himself in battle, notably at the age of 16, when he fought at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. It was a bloody affair, and Hal even took an arrow to the face. No kidding, a literal arrow. Most people would call it a day after that, but not Hal. The wound healed, leaving him with a prominent scar, a badge of honor that would remind him, and everyone else, of his resilience and bravery. This was no play acting. It was the harsh reality of medieval warfare. By the time Henry Roman IV died in 1413, leaving Hal as the new king, the prince had transformed into a savvy and experienced leader. He inherited a kingdom that was far from stable, with ongoing conflicts and financial woes that needed urgent attention. But if his wild youth taught him anything, it was that strategy and strength were his best allies. He was ready to step into the role of king, determined to make his own mark on history. So there you have it, the early life of Prince Hal, a blend of myth and reality, a young man who grew up fast in a world where the margin for error was razor-thin. From tavern tales to battlefield scars, his story is one of transformation and tenacity, setting the stage for the legendary reign of Henry V. But remember, this was just the beginning. The real drama was yet to come, and Hal was more than ready to embrace his destiny. So, King Henry V, newly crowned at the ripe age of 26, was ready to take the throne, probably with some trepidation, given the kingdom he was inheriting. Imagine getting the keys to a fixer-upper and realizing the roof leaks, the walls are crumbling, and the bank account is firmly in the red. Not exactly the dream inheritance, but Hal, now full-fledged King Henry V, wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. First order of business, consolidate power. Henry wasn't about to let England slip into the chaos that had plagued his father's reign. He knew the nobility, that ever-rebellious bunch, needed a firm hand. These were men who, given half a chance, would plot, scheme, and backstab their way to more power. Henry understood that being king meant more than just wearing a shiny crown and throwing the occasional banquet. It was a constant chess game, and he was determined to play it like a grandmaster. One of his early moves was to restore some semblance of financial stability. The royal finances, let's just say they were about as stable as a one-legged stool. England's coffers were drained from endless military campaigns, and the national debt was piling up like an overdrawn credit card. Enter Henry's economic reforms. He tightened the purse strings, streamlined royal expenses, and made sure every pound was spent wisely. It was the medieval equivalent of a government austerity program, but it was necessary to prevent the kingdom from sinking further into financial ruin. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the myth of Henry's miraculous transformation from wild youth to wise ruler. Shakespeare would have you believe it was an overnight affair, as if the crown itself zapped him into maturity. Reality check. Henry's transformation was more of a gradual evolution. While he did clean up his act, it wasn't like he flipped a switch and left his past behind. He still had the same charm and charisma that had made him a hit with the common folk, but now he wielded it with the precision of a surgeon. Speaking of his past, what about his former tavern buddies? Did Henry cut them loose, leaving them to reminisce about the good old days over tankards of ale? Not exactly. Henry understood loyalty and recognized the value in keeping old allies close, but he also knew they had to shape up. Some of his former companions found themselves in positions of minor power or influence, not exactly a seat at the king's table, but enough to keep them loyal and useful. It was a savvy move, ensuring that those who knew his youthful indiscretions had a vested interest in his success. In the realm of foreign policy, Henry had his eyes on France. The 100 Years' War was still simmering, and Henry saw an opportunity to assert his claim to the French throne, a claim that was about as complicated as a medieval soap opera plot, involving a tangle of familial ties and feudal allegiances. But for now, let's stick with his early reign. Henry's focus was on strengthening England internally before launching any foreign adventures. He was like a boxer in training, honing his skills and biding his time before stepping into the ring. The church was another area where Henry flexed his kingly muscle. He had no intention of letting the clergy run rampant, wielding power without accountability. The Lollards, a religious reform movement, were causing quite a stir with their calls for church reform and their criticism of ecclesiastical wealth. Henry, perhaps not wanting to add religious upheaval to his list of headaches, dealt with them decisively. He supported the church's crackdown on heresy, ensuring the status quo remained intact. It was a pragmatic move, but one that secured the church's support, a valuable ally for any monarch. So, there you have it, the early days of Henry V's reign, period of consolidation, reform, and careful maneuvering. He wasn't the perfect king overnight, but rather a ruler who understood the value of strategy and patience. The romantic tales of an instant transformation from rogue to ruler, more fiction than fact. Henry was a man who learned from his past, used his wits to navigate the murky waters of politics, and set the stage for the legendary feats that would define his legacy. But the real drama was yet to unfold. England was on the brink of something big, and Henry was ready to make history. As England teetered on the brink of something monumental, King Henry V had his gaze firmly fixed across the English Channel. France, a land of fine wines, fancy shadehawks, and of course, a throne that Henry believed was rightfully his. But before Henry could go charging in like a knight in shining armor, there was the small matter of logistics. You see, launching a military campaign wasn't just about rallying the troops with a rousing speech and setting sail. No, it was more akin to organizing the world's most complicated medieval road trip. First off, let's talk money. War, then as now, was an expensive affair. Henry needed to scrape together enough cash to fund his continental adventure, and the English treasury was about as robust as a house of cards. But Henry was savvy. He knew that a king's power was only as strong as his economy, so he called upon Parliament to loosen the purse strings. In 1414, They granted him a hefty tax, about £50,000, which, adjusted for inflation, is the medieval equivalent of a small fortune. Still, it wasn't just about filling the coffers. Henry needed to ensure those funds were spent wisely, like a thrifty sharper at a royal Costco. Next on the list, manpower. The English army needed to be packed to the brim with archers, knights, and foot soldiers, about 12,000 men in total. But recruiting these men wasn't as simple as posting a medieval help wanted sign. Many were lured by promises of plunder and glory, but Henry also had to worry about keeping them fed, armed, and motivated once they crossed the Channel. Imagine trying to maintain troop morale when your soldiers are more interested in looting the French countryside than following orders. It's like herding cats, but with swords. Then came the logistics of crossing the Channel, a 21-mile stretch that might as well have been the Atlantic, given the state of medieval maritime technology. The English fleet, consisting of around 500 ships, wasn't exactly the Royal Caribbean. These vessels were a motley crew of requisitioned merchant ships and hastily cobbled together crafts, not exactly what you call seaworthy. The fleet set sail from Southampton in August 1415, and while the voyage wasn't long, it was anything but smooth sailing. Seasickness was the least of their worries. The real fear was the unpredictability of the Channel's weather, which could turn a fleet of ships into driftwood faster than you can say. Stormy seas. Once safely ashore in France, the real challenges began. The French countryside wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for Henry and his men. The English army had to march over 100 miles from their landing point in Harfleur to the eventual site of the Battle of Agincourt. Picture a medieval hiking trip, but with the constant threat of ambushes by French forces and the grim reality of medieval logistics. Supply lines were a nightmare. Food was scarce, and dysentery, known as the bloody flux, ran rampant. It's hard to imagine the glamour of chivalry when you're knee-deep in mud, and your rations consist of stale bread and dubious meat. But there was no turning back for Henry. He had committed to this campaign, and retreating wasn't an option. The march to Agincourt was a test of endurance and leadership. Henry had to keep his men focused and ready for battle, even as they trudged through the muck and mire. His charisma and resolve were put to the test, and he knew that a victory on French soil would not only boost morale, but also cement his legacy as a warrior king. Now, let's pause to debunk a myth or two. The image of the brave English soldier, steadfast and noble, is a romantic notion, but the reality was far grittier. These men were mercenaries as much as patriots, motivated by the promise of spoils rather than national pride. And while Henry's famous St. Crispin's Day speech, immortalized by Shakespeare, paints a picture of unity and brotherhood, it's worth remembering that the battlefield was a chaotic, brutal place where survival often meant turning a blind eye to the rules of chivalry. As the English army closed in on Agincourt, tension mounted. The French, with their superior numbers and well-armored knights, were confident of victory. They saw the English force as a ragtag band of bedraggled invaders, ripe for the picking. But Henry had a few tricks up his sleeve. He wasn't just relying on brute strength. He had a strategic ace in the form of the English longbow. Ah, the longbow, a weapon that changed the course of medieval warfare. It was cheap to produce, easy to wield, and devastatingly effective. The English archers, many of whom were yeomen from the countryside, could unleash a hail of arrows that penetrated even the finest French armor. It was the medieval equivalent of bringing a machine gun to a sword fight, and Henry intended to use it to full effect. The longbow would be the linchpin of his strategy at Agincourt, leveling the playing field against the French knights who saw themselves as the masters of the battlefield. And so, on the morning of October 25, 1415, Henry's army stood ready to face the French at Agincourt. The stage was set for a battle that would become the stuff of legend, a clash that would define Henry's reign and leave an indelible mark on history. But as the fog lifted and the armies squared off, the harsh realities of war were laid bare. The mud was thick, the air was cold, and the stakes could not have been higher. This wasn't just a contest of arms. It was a test of will, strategy, and endurance. The Battle of Agincourt was about to begin, and the outcome would shape the destiny of England and France for generations to come. But before we dive into the chaos and carnage of the battlefield, let's take a moment to appreciate the irony of it all. Here was Henry, a king who had spent his youth dodging political pitfalls and familial drama, now leading an army to claim a foreign crown. The romantic image of the warrior king, charging into battle with a noble cause, was as appealing then as it is now. Yet beneath the surface lay a web of economic pressures, logistical challenges, and the gritty realities of medieval life. The road to Agincourt was fraught with peril, but it was a journey Henry was determined to complete. And while history would remember the glory of the battle, it's the untold stories of those who marched beside him, the foot soldiers, the archers, the forgotten heroes, that truly bring the legend to life. So, as we leave Henry and his men on the brink of battle, poised for a fight that would echo through the ages, remember this: history is as much about the myths we create as the truths we uncover. The Battle of Agincourt is a tale of triumph and tragedy, a legend and a reality, and like all great stories, it leaves us eager for the next chapter. As the curtain rose on the Battle of Agincourt, Henry V surveyed the scene before him. A misty morning, a muddy field, and two armies squaring off for what would be an epic showdown. It was the perfect setting for a blockbuster, minus the popcorn. Henry, a natural leader with a flair for the dramatic, knew this was his moment. The French, with their heavily armored knights and superior numbers, estimates put them at around 20,000 to the English's 6,000, were confident they'd steamroll the English into oblivion. But Henry had a secret weapon, a combination of muddy terrain, strategic genius, and of course, the fearsome English longbowmen. The battlefield itself was a quagmire. Recent rains had turned it into a medieval slip and slide, and Henry knew how to use this to his advantage. Unlike the French, whose knights were weighed down by armor that could double as a medieval diving suit, the English troops were lighter and more mobile. Picture a bunch of knights trying to wade through a swamp in full plate armor. It's not exactly a recipe for success. Henry's deployment was a masterclass in strategy. He positioned his men in a narrow gap between two dense woods, forcing the French to funnel into the killing zone. It was like guiding them into a meat grinder, with the English longbowmen poised to rain down arrows like a medieval hailstorm. These archers, around 5,000 of them, were the unsung heroes of the battle. Armed with longbows capable of firing arrows that could pierce armor at 200 yards, they were the equivalent of medieval snipers, deadly, efficient, and crucial to the English victory. As the French cavalry charged, the longbowmen unleashed a torrent of arrows that darkened the sky and rained down with lethal precision. The French knights, expecting a cakewalk, found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire, a reminder that arrogance on the battlefield can be as deadly as a well-aimed arrow. The mud didn't help. Horses floundered, knights stumbled, and chaos reigned as the French advance fell apart like a poorly baked soufflé. Henry was in the thick of it, leading from the front like a true warrior king. He wasn't one to sit back and watch from a safe distance. He was right there, in the mud and melee, swinging his sword and rallying his men. His leadership style was hands-on, charismatic, and frankly, a bit reckless. But it was exactly what his men needed. A king who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, literally, and dirty they got. As the French struggled to regroup, the English pressed the attack. The battlefield was a cacophony of metal on metal, the cries of wounded men, and the relentless thrum of arrows being loosed. The French knights, many of them dismounted and bogged down, were easy pickings for the English infantry, who waded into the fray with their poleaxes and maces, weapons designed to penetrate armor and make short work of a knight's glamour. But let's not forget the farcical elements of the battle. The French, in their eagerness to claim easy glory, had packed themselves into a bottleneck, turning their superior numbers into a liability. It was the medieval equivalent of trying to funnel an ocean through a straw. Desperation led to blunders, with some French knights reportedly charging without their helmets, an oversight that was, quite literally, a headache. As the battle raged, Henry's resolve never wavered. He knew that victory lay in maintaining the pressure, exploiting the French disarray, and trusting his men to hold the line. And they did. By the end of the day, the French army lay shattered, with casualties estimated between 7,000 and 10,000, compared to the English losses of around 400. It was a staggering defeat, one that sent shockwaves through France and cemented Henry's reputation as a warrior king. But what about those infamous battlefield blunders? The French were so confident in their numbers that they overlooked the basics of strategy. It's a classic case of letting bravado write checks that reality couldn't cash. And Henry, he played his hand with all the finesse of a seasoned poker player. The longbowmen, the terrain, the narrow deployment, all calculated moves that turned the odds in his favor. Yet, the real story of Agincourt isn't just about tactics and triumph. It's about the men who slogged through the mud, the archers with calloused hands who drew their bows until their fingers bled, and the grim reality of medieval warfare. The myths of chivalry and noble combat are seductive, but let's face it, war is messy, brutal, and far from noble. As the dust settled, Henry stood victorious, his legacy secured. But the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Henry would need all his cunning, charisma, and courage to navigate the complex political landscape that lay ahead. So there you have it, the Battle of Agincourt, a masterclass in strategy, a testament to leadership, and a reminder that sometimes the underdog really can triumph against the odds. As Henry's troops celebrated their improbable victory, the king knew that this was just one chapter in a much larger story. The legend of Agincourt would live on, but the real work of securing his legacy was just beginning. And as history would soon show, Henry was far from done writing his epic tale. With the echoes of Agincourt still reverberating through the courts of Europe, Henry V found himself in a unique position. He wasn't just a king basking in the glow of victory. He was a monarch on a mission, one who saw the French crown not just as a glittering prize, but as an achievable reality. The Battle of Agincourt had been a strategic masterstroke, but it was only the opening act in Henry's grand drama. Fast forward to 1420, and we find ourselves at the Treaty of Troyes, a diplomatic coup that would make any modern negotiator green with envy. The treaty, signed in May, essentially handed Henry the keys to the Kingdom of France. How's that for a plot twist? The deal recognized Henry as the heir to the French throne and promised him the hand of Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter, in marriage. Talk about a royal power couple. But before we break out the confetti, let's dissect this a bit. Why would the French agree to such terms? Well, the political landscape was a mess. France was embroiled in a civil war. Think Game of Thrones, but with more mud and fewer dragons, between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. King Charles VI of France, known not so affectionately as Charles the Mad, wasn't exactly in a position to argue. His reign was a masterclass in dysfunction, with bouts of insanity that left the French court in disarray. The Burgundians, seeing an opportunity, allied with Henry, giving him the leverage he needed to push for the treaty. Financially, the Treaty of Troyes was a godsend for England. The French agreed to pay Henry a hefty dowry for marrying Catherine, 75,000 gold crowns, which, adjusted for inflation, is enough to make a modern wedding planner weep with jealousy. But Henry's motives weren't purely economic. This was about securing a legacy, about uniting the crowns of England and France under his rule, and about cementing his place in the annals of history. The marriage to Catherine of Valois wasn't just a political maneuver. It was a union that promised a brief period of peace between the two warring nations. The wedding, held on June 2, 1420, was a lavish affair, complete with all the pageantry you'd expect from a royal union. Henry appeared every inch the triumphant king, but beneath the surface there was a ticking clock. The peace would be short-lived, and Henry's ambitions were far from fulfilled. But let's pause to reflect on the man versus the myth. Henry V is often remembered as the quintessential English hero, a warrior king with a crown in one hand and a sword in the other. Yet, the realities of his reign tell a more nuanced story. Henry was pragmatic, shrewd, and at times ruthless. His campaigns were marked by strategic brilliance, but they also left a trail of devastation. The romantic image of the chivalrous king, charging gallantly into battle, is undercut by the harsh realities of medieval warfare, where victory often meant villages burned and fields lay fallow. The Treaty of Troyes, for all its pomp, was a double-edged sword. It promised a future of unity, but was built on shaky foundations. Charles VI's agreement to disinherit his own son, the Dauphin Charles, in favor of Henry, was a decision born of desperation, not diplomacy. When Charles the Mad eventually passed away in 1422, the stage was set for a continuation of the conflict, with the young Dauphin determined to reclaim his birthright. As for Henry, his efforts to consolidate his newfound power were relentless. He returned to England in triumphant glory, only to be called back to France to quell unrest. The king was a man constantly in motion, ever the warrior, never quite the ruler at peace. Yet his charisma and leadership kept his followers loyal, driven by the promise of glory and the spoils of war. In 1422, just 2 years after the Treaty of Troyes, Henry V met an untimely end. The king, who had seemed invincible on the battlefield, succumbed to dysentery, a grim reminder that in the medieval world, even the greatest of leaders were at the mercy of the most mundane of ailments. He died at the age of 35, leaving behind a legacy as complex as it was compelling. So, how do we remember Henry V today? As a hero, a conqueror, perhaps a bit of both. His reign was short but impactful, a whirlwind of military campaigns and diplomatic triumphs that reshaped the map of Europe. The myth of Henry as a warrior king endures, immortalized by Shakespeare's stirring prose and the romanticism of a bygone era. But the man behind the myth was a study in contrasts, a king who was both visionary and ruthless, a leader whose ambition was matched only by his pragmatism. Ultimately, Henry V's legacy is a testament to the power of myth-making. He remains a symbol of English valor and determination, a figure whose story is as much about the triumphs as the trials. His reign, though brief, left an indelible mark on history, reminding us that the line between legend and reality is often as thin as a king's crown. As we draw the curtain on Henry's story, we're left with a reminder that history is as much about the stories we tell as the facts we uncover. The allure of the past lies in its complexity, in the interplay between the heroics and the hardships, the victories and the losses. Henry V's reign was a tapestry of ambition and achievement, a chapter in the grand narrative of history that continues to captivate and inspire. And while the myth may overshadow the man, the truth of his reign is a tale worth telling, a story of a king who dared to dream of a kingdom united, and nearly made it so. If you ever thought the convents of medieval Europe were bastions of serene devotion and perpetual prayer, prepare for a reality check. Behind those cloistered walls, life was less about saintly asceticism and more about dodging the arrows of worldly chaos. The truth is, many women didn't waltz into nunhood on a wave of divine calling. Instead, they were often nudged or shoved by the relentless socio-economic pressures of the time. Let's face it, medieval Europe wasn't exactly a paradise for women with a penchant for independence. First, let's talk about the dowry system. This charming tradition ensured that daughters were as much a financial burden as a beloved family member. Back in the day, the cost of marrying off a daughter could be the medieval equivalent of buying a small castle. Families with more daughters than gold often faced a tricky situation. Enter the convent, the go-to solution for surplus daughters. It was cheaper to pay a nun's dowry than a marriage one. Think of it as an early form of economic efficiency, where the convent became a kind of sanctuary/storage facility for women of all sorts. Now, before you start picturing these nuns as a homogeneous group of pious ladies, let's add some color to that palette. These women hailed from diverse backgrounds, including noble families, merchant dynasties, and sometimes even peasant lineages. Political alliances often played a role in who ended up wearing the habit. If a family wanted to curry favor with a particular monastery or bishop, sending a daughter to a convent was like gifting a strategic chess piece in a Game of Thrones. Of course, the cloistered life wasn't all hymns and holy water. For many, it was a surprising mix of relative freedom and strict discipline. Sure, there were rules, lots of them, but within those constraints, a nun could often enjoy more autonomy than her married peers. They managed convent lands, engaged in intellectual pursuits, and sometimes even wielded political influence. It was a far cry from the passive, submissive stereotype we often imagine. And here's where it gets spicy: carnal scandals. Yes, the juxtaposition of nun and carnal seems laughably contradictory, but the medieval era was a time when reality often chuckled at expectations. These women were expected to embody piety, but human nature has a pesky way of poking through the most formidable vows. The carnal scandals that occasionally erupted were as much a product of this tension as they were of the human need for connection. The Church, never one to ignore a juicy scandal, took these breaches of chastity seriously. But the truth is, the convents were sometimes as much about keeping women out of trouble as they were about keeping trouble out of women. The combination of strict rules, limited male interaction, and an environment rife with religious fervor set the stage for drama that wouldn't be out of place in a medieval soap opera. In the coming series, we'll plunge deeper into these scandals, exploring how they unfolded and why they mattered. We'll dissect the juicy details, and trust me, they're juicier than a medieval feast. But for now, just know that beneath the veil of piety, there lurked whispers of rebellion and tales that would make even the most seasoned gossip blush. So, let's plunge right into the murky waters of medieval convents, where tales of rebellion and scandal could make even the most seasoned gossip columnist blush. Take the convent of St. Croix in Poitiers, for instance. This wasn't your average, quiet haven of piety. Oh no, this place was the medieval equivalent of a reality TV show, complete with all the drama and unexpected plot twists you could imagine. In the 11th century, the convent found itself embroiled in a scandal that would have the ecclesiastical hierarchy reaching for their rosaries. It all kicked off when the nuns of St. Croix decided that the strict rules of monastic life were more of a suggestion than a mandate. We're talking about a convent where the lines between sacred vows and earthly pleasures were not just blurred, they were practically erased. The sisters were accused of indulging in feasts, merriment, and gasp, even romantic dalliances. It was as if they were living in a medieval rom-com, except with a lot more Latin. The Bishop of Poitiers didn't find this debauchery amusing, not one bit. He penned a letter dripping with disapproval, demanding reform. But let's be real. Reforming a group of headstrong nuns wasn't exactly a walk in the cloister. The nuns were like a medieval girl band, defying expectations and living life on their own terms. This tussle between the bishop and the nuns exemplifies how convents could become hotspots of resistance against the rigid confines of religious life. Fast forward a few centuries to the 15th century, and we find ourselves amidst the notorious tales of the naughty nuns. These stories weren't just whispered in the hallowed halls of monasteries, they were shouted from the rooftops. The chronicles are peppered with accounts of nuns who, shall we say, strayed from the path of righteousness. One such tale involves a convent in Italy where the sisters were said to have taken the concept of love thy neighbor a bit too literally. Rumors flew fast and thick about secret trysts and forbidden lovers sneaking into the convent under the cover of darkness. These narratives weren't just entertaining, they were cautionary tales, reminding the pious folk of the dangers of unchecked female autonomy. But let's not forget, these stories were often exaggerated by those with a vested interest in maintaining the patriarchal status quo. It's like the medieval version of tabloid journalism, where a simple hug could be spun into a torrid love affair. And while some of these tales were undoubtedly true, many were the result of overactive imaginations combined with a healthy dose of misogyny. The economic and social pressures faced by these women were immense. For many, entering a convent wasn't a choice made out of devotion, but necessity. Families often sent their daughters to convents not only to save on dowries, but also to secure a place in heaven by donating to the church. It was a win-win situation, except for the women who found themselves behind convent walls with little agency over their own lives. These scandals, while salacious, also highlight a deeper issue, the struggle for personal freedom within the confines of religious life. The nuns' acts of rebellion, whether real or imagined, were a form of resistance against the rigid structures that sought to control every aspect of their existence. It's a testament to the enduring human spirit, which, throughout history, has always found ways to push back against oppression. As you can imagine, these incidents were like manna from heaven for later historians and chroniclers looking to spice up their narratives. They took these tales of naughty nuns and ran with them, embellishing and sensationalizing every juicy detail. The more scandalous the story, the more likely it was to be remembered and retold. However, it's crucial to remember that these stories, while entertaining, also served a purpose. It reinforced societal norms and reminded women of the supposed dangers of stepping outside the lines. The legend of the naughty nun became both a tool of oppression and a symbol of rebellion, depending on who was telling the tale. So there you have it, a glimpse into the world of medieval nunneries, where scandal and sanctity often walked hand in hand. But don't worry, we're just getting started. In our next installment, we'll delve even deeper into these tales of intrigue, exploring the broader implications of these scandals and what they tell us about the society that produced them. So stay tuned, because if you thought things were juicy now, you ain't seen nothing yet. Now that we've dipped our toes into the sizzling scandals of medieval convents, it's time to wade deeper into the treacherous waters of politics and economics that rippled through these cloistered communities. Get ready, because convents weren't just about prayer and piety. They were pivotal players in the medieval power game, often caught in the crossfire between ambition and obligation. Let's start with the high-stakes world of land ownership. You see, in medieval Europe, land was like the medieval equivalent of cryptocurrency, volatile, valuable, and the cause of endless bickering. Convents, endowed with vast tracts of land over centuries, were no strangers to these territorial tussles. Wealthy families would donate land to convents in a bid to secure a spot in the celestial VIP lounge. But let's be real, these donations often came with more strings attached than a medieval loot. Take the Abbey of Fontevraud, for instance. Founded in 1101, this convent became a power player, thanks in part to its extensive land holdings. By the 12th century, it had amassed properties across France and England. Talk about a real estate portfolio that would make any medieval mogul blush. But this wasn't just about divine devotion. Controlling land meant controlling wealth and influence, and Fontevraud's abbesses wielded significant clout in regional politics. They were the medieval equivalent of power brokers, navigating the treacherous waters of feudal allegiance with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. Of course, with great power comes great responsibility, and even greater headaches. These lands often became the focal point of disputes that would make today's courtroom dramas look like child's play. When noble families weren't squabbling over who owned what, they were busy using convents to seal political alliances. Sending a daughter to a convent wasn't just a matter of spiritual salvation. It was a strategic move in the game of feudal chess. Think of it as the ultimate medieval merger, where vows of chastity doubled as binding contracts. But here's where things get really interesting. Some convents weren't content to merely play the hand they were dealt. They wanted to shuffle the deck. Convents like the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland weren't just passive landholders. They were active economic agents, running everything from breweries to mills. By the 13th century, St. Gall was raking in profits from its brewing operations, proving that even nuns appreciated the finer things in life, like a well-crafted ale. This financial independence was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it allowed convents to operate with a degree of autonomy that was rare for women in medieval society. On the other hand, it thrust them into the murky world of medieval economics, where moral and ethical dilemmas were as common as fleas on a monastery cat. When a convent's economic interests clashed with its religious duties, you can bet there were more than a few raised eyebrows and whispered prayers for divine guidance. And let's not forget the unintended consequences of these financial dealings. As convents amassed wealth and influence, they also attracted envy and suspicion. Rumors of corruption and greed spread faster than a medieval plague, fueling scandals that would have made even the most stoic monk reach for a stiff drink. Critics accused nuns of living in luxury, feasting on delicacies, while the peasants outside their walls scraped by on bread and water. It's the age-old tale of haves and have-nots, played out on a stage where the actors wore habits instead of crowns. But let's not get too carried away with the image of nuns living like queens in their cloistered palaces. While some convents did enjoy relative prosperity, others struggled to make ends meet, caught between the demands of their spiritual mission and the harsh realities of economic survival. It's a tale as old as time. Money changes everything, and not always for the better. So, as we delve deeper into the saga of medieval convents, remember that these were not just places of prayer and contemplation. They were dynamic, complex communities, navigating the turbulent waters of politics and economics with all the grace and grit of a medieval warrior. And while their stories may be shrouded in myth and legend, the reality was often far more fascinating and far more human. Stay tuned, because the plot is about to thicken. In our next installment, we'll explore the broader societal implications of these scandals and what they reveal about the world that produced them. Trust me, if you thought the convents were juicy before, you're in for a wild ride. So, as the plot thickens, let's dive into how the perceptions of these convent capers have been shaped, skewed, and downright sensationalized over the centuries. When it comes to medieval nunneries, art and literature have been guilty of cranking up the drama knob to 11. Think of it as the medieval version of a tabloid, but with more parchment and fewer glossy photos. First, we need to look at the medieval manuscripts. These weren't exactly your everyday beach reads, more like the Netflix of their time, but with a lot more Latin. These manuscripts, often penned by monks with a flair for the dramatic, loved to weave tales of nuns gone wild. They painted these women as temptresses who could make even the most devout monk consider trading his vows for a romp in the hay. One chronicled tale tells of a nun who managed to sneak out of her convent for a midnight rendezvous with a lover, only to be caught by the vigilant abbess. The story ends with divine retribution, because of course it does. It's like an episode of Crime and Punishment, convent edition. But why were these tales so popular? For one, they served as cautionary tales. They were juicy enough to keep you turning the page, but moralistic enough to remind everyone why straying from the straight and narrow was a bad idea. It's like the medieval version of a moral fable, but with added scandal for good measure. The church found these stories particularly useful. They offered a perfect blend of entertainment and edification, a way to keep the faithful on their toes by reminding them of the sinful chaos that awaited beyond the convent walls. Then we moved to art, where the nuns were often depicted as pious, serene figures on one end of the spectrum, or as lascivious, wayward women on the other. It's a bit like seeing the same actress play a nun in one movie and a femme fatale in the next. These contrasting images fueled the fire of imagination, allowing artists to explore themes of temptation, virtue, and redemption. Take, for instance, the 15th century frescoes of the Last Judgment in Florence's Santa Maria Novella, where sinful nuns were painted alongside demons. Subtlety wasn't exactly their strong suit. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and the narrative gets a splash of color, literally and figuratively. Writers like Boccaccio, in his Decameron, spun tales of nuns who were less about cloistered life and more about clandestine love affairs. Boccaccio's stories, with their playful yet biting satire, painted a picture of convents not as places of prayer, but as hotbeds of intrigue and desire. It was like a medieval soap opera, with enough twists and turns to keep readers hooked. These stories weren't just about nuns. They were a commentary on the hypocrisy of religious institutions, using humor as a scalpel to dissect societal norms. So why do these stories persist? Well, there's a timeless allure to the idea of the forbidden. It's why tales of naughty nuns have endured, from medieval manuscripts to modern movies. These narratives tap into a deep-seated fascination with rebellion against authority, the thrill of breaking taboos, and the complexity of human desires. They're stories that straddle the line between sin and sanctity, making them irresistible to audiences across the ages. But let's not forget, these tales have also been used to reinforce some pretty unflattering stereotypes about women and their role in society. By portraying nuns as either paragons of virtue or paragons of vice, these narratives often ignored the complex realities of life in a convent, the economic pressures, the political machinations, and the genuine struggles for autonomy. It's a bit like judging an entire book by its steamy cover. And while we're debunking myths, let's address the elephant in the cloister, the idea that nuns were entirely cut off from the world. In reality, convents were hubs of activity and interaction. They received visitors, dealt in trade, and even hosted events. Far from being isolated, nuns were often deeply embedded in the social and economic fabric of their communities. They were more like community managers than hermits. So, as we wade through these stories of scandal and sainthood, remember that the truth is often more mundane and more fascinating than fiction. The legends of carnal nuns may make for compelling stories, but they also reveal much about the societies that produced them. These tales, with their blend of fact and fable, remind us of the enduring human fascination with the sacred and the profane, the push and pull between duty and desire. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where we'll continue to unravel the mysteries of medieval convents. We'll delve deeper into how these enduring myths have shaped our understanding of history and why they continue to captivate us. Trust me, there's plenty more where that came from, and you won't want to miss a minute of it. As we wrap up our medieval nun saga, it's time to step back and take a good, hard look at what these tales of cloistered chaos really tell us about history, myth, and the ever-complicated nature of morality. These women, living behind stone walls and beneath the weight of both religious devotion and human desires, offer a unique window into the societal norms of the Middle Ages. And let's be honest, they also remind us that humanity's love for a juicy scandal is about as old as time itself. First things first, let's tackle the myth versus reality conundrum. What we've seen is that the stories of naughty nuns weren't just idle gossip. They reflected real tensions between societal expectations and personal autonomy. These women, often thrust into convent life by circumstance rather than choice, found themselves navigating a labyrinth of religious duty and personal desire. The legends that grew around them weren't entirely fabricated. They were exaggerations of the very real struggles these women faced. It's a classic case of where there's smoke, there's fire, albeit with a lot of extra kindling thrown on for good measure. Now, when we talk about these stories, we're really delving into a medieval morality play. On one hand, you had the church, which loved to use these tales as cautionary examples. The message was clear: stray from the path, and chaos will ensue. But on the other hand, these stories also served as a subtle form of resistance. They highlighted the absurdity of trying to suppress basic human instincts and desires. In a way, the naughty nun narrative was a medieval version of sticking it to the man, or, in this case, the bishop. And let's not forget the economic angle. Convents, as we've seen, were often economic powerhouses. They managed lands, engaged in trade, and wielded significant influence. This economic clout was both a blessing and a curse. It gave the nuns a rare degree of independence, but also made them targets for criticism and control. The moral of the story: money talks, even if you're wearing a habit. So, what does all this tell us about human nature? Well, for one, it shows us that the human penchant for scandal and storytelling is a timeless trait. From medieval manuscripts to modern tabloids, we love a good tale of rebellion and intrigue. And while the specifics may change, the underlying themes of power, autonomy, and desire remain constant. In reflecting on the legacy of these medieval nuns, we see that they were far from passive participants in their own stories. They were active agents navigating a world that often sought to confine them. Their stories of scandal and sanctity aren't just about naughty behavior. They're about the complexities of human nature and the eternal struggle for freedom and self-expression. As we draw parallels to modern times, it's clear that the allure of a scandal hasn't lost its luster. Today's headlines might feature politicians or celebrities, but the underlying human fascination with the forbidden remains. Whether it's a medieval nun sneaking out for a midnight rendezvous or a pop star caught in a compromising position, the thrill of the story is universal. In conclusion, the tales of medieval nuns offer us more than just juicy gossip from centuries past. They provide a lens through which we can examine the enduring themes of power, morality, and human desire. These stories remind us that while times may change, the core of human experience remains remarkably constant. So the next time you hear a scandalous story, remember, it's just another chapter in the long, colorful history of human nature. And who knows, maybe in a few centuries, people will be looking back at our scandals with the same mix of fascination and bemusement. In the bustling chaos of early 19th century America, where Carta was king, and the word abolitionist could earn you a side-eye or worse, Harriet Beecher Stowe was quietly being ironed into shape amid the din of 13 Beecher children. Yes, 13, because apparently 9 kids just didn't cut it for the Beechers. Harriet was lucky number 7, right smack in the middle of a family that seemed to have a penchant for producing fiery sermonizers like other families grew prize roses. The Beecher family was an institution in itself, led by Lyman Beecher, a Calvinist minister and all-around pious guy who believed that a good sermon could solve just about anything, including the national debt. The Beechers were a breed apart, a kind of 19th century version of the Kardashians, except instead of reality TV, they were all about reality sermons. Lyman was known for his fiery speeches that could probably light a candle from across the room. He was the type who'd rather preach than eat, though with 13 mouths to feed, you can't blame him for skipping a meal or two. Growing up in such a family, Harriet didn't really have a choice but to absorb the social crusading spirit like a sponge. If you weren't rallying against something by breakfast, you were likely missing the point. The family's New England roots were deeply entwined with the cultural and economic shifts of the time. By 1820, the Industrial Revolution was revving its engines, and the Transportation Revolution was laying down the iron tracks that would steamroll the old way of life. While the economy was whirring into modernity, the moral compass of the nation was being stretched in all sorts of uncomfortable directions. The Beecher household was a cacophony of ideals and ideologies, with visitors ranging from traveling preachers to social reformers, each adding their own spice to the intellectual stew. This was the kind of place where a young Harriet might overhear a spirited debate over the dinner table about the merits of abolition versus colonization, while someone passed the mashed potatoes and another scribbled notes for a future sermon on the back of a napkin. It's no wonder Harriet developed a knack for storytelling. When you're one of 13, you either learn to make your voice heard or you quietly fade into the background noise. Harriet chose the former. Her early education came from a mix of homeschooling and local institutions, but it was the Litchfield Female Academy that gave her a taste for the written word. There, she was taught by Sarah Pierce, a woman who believed that girls deserved more than needlepoint and the ability to faint gracefully. Meanwhile, America was a land of contradictions. On one hand, it prided itself on being the land of the free. On the other, it was a nation where freedom was a luxury not afforded to everyone, especially not to the enslaved people working the fields in the South. The economic engine was powered by cotton, and cotton was most definitely powered by slavery. It was a time when the term Southern hospitality was as likely to refer to the size of your plantation as to your manners. In this context, Harriet's formative years were a cocktail of cultural upheaval and moral questioning. By the time she hit her late teens, the country was gearing up for a mighty clash of ideals, and Harriet was quietly taking notes. The economic realities of the nation were a stark backdrop to her family's idealism. The market economy was expanding, and with it, the chasm between the industrial North and the agrarian South was growing wider than the Mississippi. Harriet wasn't just passively observing these developments, she was marinating in them. As the seventh child, she had a front-row seat to the debates that would eventually shape her writing. Her siblings were all overachievers in their own right. Henry Ward Beecher, for instance, would become a famed preacher and reformer, while Catherine Beecher was a champion for women's education. It was a family that practically oozed reformist zeal out of every pore. The financial landscape of the time was no less turbulent. The Panic of 1819 had left its mark, and by the 1830, the economy was on a roller coaster of booms and busts. If you were looking for stability, you were probably born in the wrong century. The Beechers, despite their intellectual wealth, were not rolling in cash. Lyman's job as a preacher didn't exactly come with stock options, and feeding 13 kids meant they often knew the meaning of frugality firsthand. But if anything, the Beecher brood thrived on adversity. They were like those plants that grow through cracks in the sidewalk, finding their way to sunlight despite the odds. Harriet's childhood was a training ground in resilience, a theme that would let her permeate her most famous work. She learned to navigate the complexities of a world that was simultaneously expanding and contracting, a place where ideals were constantly being tested against harsh realities. So, Harriet grew up in a household where words were both currency and weaponry. In a world that often saw women as decorative, Harriet was being groomed, perhaps unknowingly, for a future where her words would change the course of history. She was soaking up the conversations, the sermons, the debates, and even the silences, all of which would let her spill out onto the pages of her writing. By the time she was ready to venture into the world on her own terms, Harriet Beecher Stowe was already a product of her environment. A young woman shaped by the moral fervor of her family, the economic fluctuations of her nation, and the cultural currents of a society on the brink of transformation. As the 19th century continued to unfold with all its messy contradictions, Harriet was poised to take her place not just as an observer, but as a chronicler and challenger of the status quo. The stage was set for a life that would be anything but ordinary. The stage was set for a life that would be anything but ordinary, and in 1836, Harriet Beecher stepped into a new chapter by marrying Calvin Stowe. Now, if you've never heard of Calvin, he wasn't just any guy. He was a biblical scholar, a professor, and perhaps most importantly, someone who was about as financially savvy as a goldfish with a credit card. You see, Calvin was one of those guys for whom the life of the mind was a full-time gig, and money was, well, optional. But hey, who needs a steady income when you have love? Harriet and Calvin set up shop in Cincinnati, a city that was basically the Switzerland of America, right on the Ohio River, a liquid Mason-Dixon line separating the free states from the slave states. It was a place where you could practically throw a stone across the river and hit Kentucky, where slavery was alive and unfortunately kicking. Living in Cincinnati was like signing up for a front-row seat to the nation's most uncomfortable reality show. You had free black communities, abolitionists, slave catchers, and escaped slaves all mingling in a city that was one part melting pot, one part pressure cooker. Financially speaking, the Stowe's marriage was a bit of a roller coaster, though less like Space Mountain and more like that rickety Ferris wheel your grandma told you to avoid at the county fair. Calvin's academic gigs weren't exactly lucrative, and Harriet's earnings from riding were at the time more like pocket change than a paycheck. Despite their monetary woes, the Stowes were committed to making a difference. They were part of the anti-slavery movement, a cause that paid exactly $0 per hour, but offered the kind of moral satisfaction you couldn't buy at any price. The couple had 7 children, which, when added to their financial struggles, made for a household that was more chaotic than a rooster in a henhouse. Harriet's days were filled with the noise and demands of family life, but she was never too busy to write. In fact, it was in the midst of this domestic whirlwind that she found inspiration. While her children clamored for attention, Harriet turned to the pen, creating stories that would eventually echo far beyond their modest home. One of the most profound influences on Harriet's writing came from the stories of escaped slaves she met in Cincinnati. Imagine sitting at your kitchen table, sipping on a steaming cup of whatever passed for coffee back then, while someone who had risked life and limb to escape bondage told you their harrowing tale. These weren't just stories. They were testimonies that laid bare the brutal realities of human enslavement. For Harriet, these stories weren't just heartbreaking. They were galvanizing. Cincinnati was a hotspot for the Underground Railroad, a secret network of routes and safe houses used by enslaved people to escape to free states and Canada. Harriet's brother, Henry Ward Beecher, who would later become a famous preacher, once said, "There is more to be learned from listening to the stories of those who have endured than from 1,000 dusty sermons." Okay, maybe he didn't say exactly that, but the point stands. Harriet listened, and what she heard shaped her work in ways that were both powerful and profound. But let's not romanticize it too much. The Underground Railroad wasn't a literal railroad with conductors shouting, "All aboard for freedom." It was a risky and illegal operation, and those involved faced severe consequences if caught. Harriet knew the stakes were high, and the courage she witnessed was a stark reminder of the moral imperative to act. Her home became a waypoint for those on the perilous journey northward, and in those quiet moments between the chaos, her resolve only strengthened. Calvin, for his part, was supportive of Harriet's burgeoning riding career, though perhaps more in the "yes, dear, whatever you say" sort of way than as a managerial force. He took pride in her talents, even if her success didn't exactly translate into a windfall for the family coffers. The couple's financial struggles were a persistent backdrop, but they were also a crucible for Harriet's creativity. There's nothing like a little economic anxiety to get the creative juices flowing. In this environment, Harriet began to sketch the outlines of what would become her most famous work, Uncle Tom's Cabin. The stories she heard and the people she met infused her writing with authenticity and urgency. She wasn't just spinning tales. She was crafting a narrative that would challenge the nation's conscience. The financial pinch may have been ever-present, but it was in these lean years that Harriet honed her craft, turning personal struggle into literary gold. The Stowe's proximity to the border of free and slave states provided a unique vantage point, a daily reminder of the country's divisions and the human cost of those divides. Harriet's writing didn't just spring from imagination. It was informed by the lived experiences of those around her. It was gritty, it was real, and it was unapologetically aimed at shaking the status quo. As the economic engine of slavery continued to churn in the South, the moral and economic conflicts of the nation played out in microcosm right in Harriet's own backyard. Cotton fields of the South were a world away, but their influence was felt even in the streets of Cincinnati. The city was a hub of commerce and industry, a place where the goods produced by slave labor were bought and sold, a stark reminder of how interconnected the nation's fortunes truly were. In this fraught landscape, Harriet's writing became a form of activism, a way to bear witness and demand change. Her stories were not just entertainment, they were calls to action. The financial and domestic challenges she faced were real, but they also served as fuel for her creative fire. Harriet Beecher Stowe wasn't just writing stories. She was crafting a narrative that would eventually help change the course of history. So, as the Stowes navigated the ups and downs of life in Cincinnati, Harriet was quietly laying the groundwork for a literary revolution. Her pen became a weapon, her words a clarion call against the injustices she could no longer ignore. In the midst of financial struggles and domestic chaos, she found her voice, a voice that would echo far beyond the confines of her Ohio home, challenging a nation to reckon with its most profound contradictions. And that, my friends, is how you turn a life of everyday chaos into a catalyst for monumental change. Stay tuned, because Harriet's story is just getting started. And so, in the frenzy of family life and financial uncertainty, Harriet Beecher Stowe was inching ever closer to a momentous literary breakthrough. Her home may have been a whirlwind of activity, but beneath the clamor, an idea was taking shape, one that would soon rock the nation to its core. Enter Uncle Tom's Cabin, the book that would cost $300 to print and sell a jaw-dropping 300,000 copies in its first year. That's right, folks, Harriet's pen was about to become mightier than a whole army of southern plantation owners. The creation of Uncle Tom's Cabin wasn't a neatly planned affair. It was more like an artistic explosion. Harriet was writing feverishly, her fingers racing across the page, as if the stories she'd heard over the years were finally finding their way out in a torrent of ink. Her writing wasn't just fueled by creative passion, but by a burning sense of moral outrage. You could say the book was part novel, part battle cry, a call to arms against the monstrous institution of slavery. Now, let's talk about that $300 printing cost. In today's money, that's about $10,000, a hefty sum for a household that probably pinched pennies like they were made of gold. Harriet's publisher, John P. Jewett, took a gamble on this unknown novel, and boy, did it pay off. When the book hit the shelves in 1852, it sold like hotcakes with extra syrup. Within a year, 300,000 copies had been snapped up in the United States alone. For context, that's about one copy for every 70 Americans at the time. It was a publishing phenomenon that made the New York Times bestseller list look like a school bake sale. So, what was it about this book that captured the public's imagination? Well, for one, Harriet didn't shy away from showing the brutal realities of slavery. Her depictions were raw and unflinching, a stark contrast to the sanitized versions that many Americans preferred to believe. Uncle Tom, Eliza, and the other characters became real to readers, not just figments of Harriet's imagination, but representations of the very real human suffering that had been happening right under their noses. Uncle Tom's Cabin wasn't just a story. It was a mirror held up to society's face, reflecting the ugly truths that many would rather ignore. The novel struck a nerve, igniting a firestorm of controversy. In the North, it was embraced as a rallying cry for abolition, proof that literature could indeed change hearts and minds. Meanwhile, in the South, it was condemned as slander, a pernicious piece of Yankee propaganda that distorted the benign institution of slavery. Yes, that's right. Some folks genuinely thought that slavery was a kindness. Bless their misguided hearts. The backlash from the South was swift and fierce. Southern newspapers lambasted the book, calling it everything from a pack of lies to abolitionist trash. Plantation owners were outraged, and pro-slavery advocates churned out rebuttals with titles like Aunt Phyllis's Cabin and The Planter's Northern Bride, hoping to counter Harriet's narrative with their own tales of happy slaves and benevolent masters. Spoiler alert, they didn't quite have the same impact. It's hard to spin a good yarn when your premise is fundamentally flawed. Meanwhile, Harriet Beecher Stowe was catapulted from relative obscurity to international fame. Her book was translated into multiple languages and sold like hotcakes across Europe. It was said that when Harriet met President Abraham Lincoln in 1862, he reportedly greeted her with, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." Now, whether Honest Abe actually said those exact words is up for debate, but the sentiment captures the colossal impact of her work. But let's not get carried away with the romanticism of it all. Harriet's newfound fame came with its own set of challenges. She was thrust into the public eye, a position that brought both adulation and scorn. Her life was dissected in the press, and critics took aim at everything from her writing style to her personal life. Fame, it turned out, was a double-edged sword, sharp enough to cut through the noise, but just as likely to leave a mark on its wielder. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin also brought an influx of correspondence from readers, some supportive, others less so. Harriet received letters from abolitionists thanking her for giving voice to their cause, as well as hate mail from pro-slavery advocates who saw her as a threat to their way of life. It was as if Harriet had struck a collective nerve, and the reverberations were being felt across the country. Despite the criticism, Harriet was undeterred. She continued to write and speak out against slavery, using her platform to advocate for change. Her pen became a lightning rod for the abolitionist movement, drawing attention to the moral and economic contradictions of a nation that claimed to value liberty while denying it to millions. Harriet's words were more than just ink on paper. They were a catalyst for a nation teetering on the brink of transformation. So, there you have it, the story of how a modest preacher's daughter from Connecticut became one of the most influential voices of her time. Harriet Beecher Stowe didn't set out to become a household name or to ignite a political firestorm, but that's exactly what she did. Her novel was more than just a bestseller. It was a wake-up call, a challenge to a nation to live up to its founding ideals. And while Uncle Tom's Cabin may have been born from the chaos of her domestic life, its impact was anything but ordinary. As we leave Harriet in the midst of her newfound celebrity, it's clear that her story is far from over. The ripple effects of her work would continue to be felt in the years to come as the nation grappled with the realities of slavery and the fight for justice. So, stay tuned as we dive deeper into the life and legacy of this remarkable woman, whose words helped change the course of history. The story of Harriet Beecher Stowe is just getting started, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Harriet Beecher Stowe had set the literary world on fire with Uncle Tom's Cabin, and her fame was spreading faster than a 19th century gossip column. But what do you do when you've just written the most incendiary piece of literature since the Bible? Well, if you're Harriet, you pack your bags and head to Europe. That's right. Harriet took her newfound celebrity status across the Atlantic, where she rubbed elbows with the literary elite and royalty. And let's just say, the cultural exchange was nothing short of a spectacle. Now, traveling to Europe in the mid-1800s wasn't as simple as harping on a plane. We're talking about a transatlantic journey that could take weeks, depending on the weather and the mood of the ocean. But Harriet wasn't alone. She was accompanied by her husband Calvin and their 7 children. Imagine the chaos of a family road trip, but on a ship and with 19th century amenities, or lack thereof. Yet, even seasickness and cramped quarters couldn't dampen Harriet's spirits. Upon arrival, Harriet was welcomed like a rock star, though without the paparazzi and questionable fashion choices. Her book had made her a household name, and readers were eager to meet the woman behind the words. Her travels took her to England, Scotland, and France, where she was feted by literary giants and even received an audience with Queen Victoria. Yes, the Queen herself wanted a word with Harriet, which is the 19th century equivalent of getting retweeted by Beyoncé. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Harriet was an American through and through, and her interactions with the European aristocracy were a comedy of cultural misunderstandings. For starters, her Yankee straightforwardness was often met with bewilderment. Europeans were accustomed to a certain level of decorum and subtlety, while Harriet was more like a social bulldozer, her honesty as blunt as a hammer. It's like she turned up to a tea party with a megaphone, and the results were as awkward as you'd imagine. Take her meeting with Charles Dickens, for example. The 2 literary titans sat down for what should have been a meeting of the minds, but Harriet's earnestness and moral fervor clashed with Dickens' more sardonic British wit. It was like pairing a firecracker with a damp squib. Entertaining, sure, but not quite the intellectual fireworks one might expect. And then there were the fashion faux pas. Let's just say that Harriet wasn't exactly a style icon. Her practical American wardrobe was a stark contrast to the lavish gowns and finery of the European elite. Imagine turning up to the Met Gala in a pair of Crocs and a windbreaker. That was Harriet, more or less. But a lack of sartorial elegance was part of her charm, an embodiment of her priorities. She was more interested in social justice than social standing, and if that meant a few raised eyebrows, so be it. Despite the occasional awkwardness, Harriet's European tour was a resounding success. Her message resonated across the continent, where abolitionist sentiments were gaining traction. The British public, in particular, was captivated by her tales of American slavery, which seemed as distant and barbaric to them as medieval torture devices. It was as if Harriet had peeled back the curtain on an ugly reality that many in Europe preferred to ignore, and in doing so, she became a symbol of the transatlantic fight against oppression. But Harriet's European adventure wasn't just about hobnobbing with the elite and sipping tea with queens. She was also on a mission to raise funds for the abolitionist cause. The economic realities of slavery were a global issue. Harriet was acutely aware that change required more than just words. She delivered talks, attended fundraisers, and networked with like-minded individuals who could help further the cause. Harriet Beecher Stowe was not just an author, she was an activist, and her pen was only one of many tools in her arsenal. While in Europe, Harriet also took the opportunity to observe the social and economic conditions of the working class. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and cities were swelling with laborers who toiled long hours in grim conditions. The stark divide between rich and poor was as apparent in London as it was in New York, and Harriet couldn't help but draw parallels between the exploitation she witnessed and the plight of enslaved people back home. It was a reminder that the struggle for human dignity was not confined to American shores. It was a universal battle. As Harriet continued her tour, she encountered a cast of characters that would have made for a great novel in itself. There were abolitionists who treated her like a messiah, skeptics who questioned her motives, and the occasional aristocrat who viewed her activism as a quaint American pastime. But Harriet took it all in stride, her sense of humor and indomitable spirit guiding her through the cultural maze. Back home, Harriet's European journey was making headlines, and her letters were published in American newspapers, further cementing her status as a public figure. The American public was fascinated by her adventures, and her accounts of the Old World offered a tantalizing glimpse into a life that was worlds apart from the daily grind of 19th century America. But let's be clear, Harriet's trip wasn't just a glamorous jaunt across Europe. It was a strategic move in the larger battle against slavery. Her presence in Europe helped galvanize international support for the abolitionist cause, adding pressure on American policymakers who were grappling with the growing divide between North and South. Harriet was planting seeds of change on both sides of the Atlantic, and her travels were a testament to the power of words to transcend borders. As her European tour drew to a close, Harriet returned to America with a renewed sense of purpose. The cultural misunderstandings and sartorial missteps were all part of the journey, but the real takeaway was the impact she had made. Harriet Beecher Stowe had not only written a book that shook the foundation of American society, she had become a global advocate for human rights. Her experiences abroad added a new dimension to her activism, and she returned home ready to continue the fight. But the story doesn't end there. Harriet's journey was far from over, and the challenges she faced were only beginning to unfold. The success of Uncle Tom's Cabin was a milestone, but it was also a catalyst for a larger movement that would ultimately shape the future of the nation. Harriet was more than just an author. She was a pioneer, blazing a trail for those who would follow in her footsteps. So, as we leave Harriet on the cusp of her next chapter, remember that her story is a reminder of the power of words to change the world. Her European adventure was just one piece of a larger puzzle, a testament to the resilience and tenacity of a woman who dared to speak truth to power. Stay tuned, because Harriet's journey is far from over, and the next chapter promises to be just as compelling as the last. As Harriet Beecher Stowe returned to American soil, her European escapade had left her with more than just a collection of royal handshakes and tea-stained dresses. It had bolstered her resolve and expanded her vision, leaving her ready to tackle the next chapter of her life with the same fervor that had propelled Uncle Tom's Cabin into the annals of history. But as the applause for her literary triumph faded, the real work was just beginning. Now, let's talk legacy, the kind that comes with a capital L and a side of historical baggage. Harriet's portrayal as the little woman who wrote the book that started the Great War, as Lincoln allegedly quipped, is one of those catchy narratives that sticks like gum to a shoe. It's romantic, it's tidy, and like most sound bites, it's only partially true. Sure, Uncle Tom's Cabin was a catalyst, but it wasn't the sole spark in a powder keg that had been simmering for decades. The reality is, Harriet's work came at a time when the United States was already a pressure cooker of conflicting ideologies. The economic divide between the industrial North and the agrarian, slave-dependent South was widening by the day. By the 1850, the nation was like a dysfunctional family Thanksgiving dinner where everyone's just one snide comment away from a mashed potato fight. Harriet's book didn't start the Civil War. It was more like a well-aimed dinner roll that got everyone's attention. Economically speaking, the South was heavily invested in slavery. We're talking about a system that was worth an estimated $3 billion in the 1860, about $90 billion today. That's a whole lot of economic incentive to maintain the status quo, and Harriet's narrative was a direct challenge to that financial juggernaut. Her book didn't just humanize the enslaved. It put a spotlight on the moral hypocrisy of a nation founded on liberty while profiting from bondage. But let's not give Harriet all the credit, or blame, depending on your perspective. The mythology of her as the solitary crusader simplifies a complex tapestry of abolitionists, activists, and ordinary people who contributed to the cause. Harriet was a pivotal piece of a larger puzzle, one that included everyone from Frederick Douglass to the countless unnamed individuals who risked everything for freedom. It was a movement, not a monologue. Fast forward to the 21st century, and Harriet's legacy still resonates. Her work laid the groundwork for literature as activism, a tradition that's alive and well today. Books like The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas and Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates echo Harriet's spirit, using narrative to confront uncomfortable truths and spark dialogue. Harriet showed us that stories have power, the power to challenge, to change, and to endure. But here's the kicker. Harriet's life wasn't just a string of successes. She faced criticism from all sides, from those who thought she went too far to those who thought she didn't go far enough. She was a lightning rod, and being one isn't exactly a walk in the park. Her life was a constant balancing act between public expectation and personal conviction, a reminder that being on the right side of history doesn't always come with immediate applause. And let's not forget the economic struggles that continued to dog Harriet even after her literary success. Fame doesn't pay the bills, as they say, and Harriet's household was often a financial juggling act. Despite the book's success, the Stowes were never rolling in dough. It's a reminder that even the most impactful work doesn't always translate into economic security, an uncomfortable truth that many artists and activists know all too well. Harriet also spent her later years advocating for women's rights, a cause that dovetailed with her abolitionist beliefs. She saw the interconnectedness of social justice issues long before intersectionality became a buzzword. In her eyes, the fight for freedom was a universal one, whether it concerned race, gender, or class. Her activism was holistic, and she approached it with the same tenacity that had fueled her writing. Now, about Harriet's mythologized image. While it's easy to cast her as a saintly figure swathed in virtue, the real Harriet was complex, flawed, and very much human. She was prone to bouts of self-doubt, and was far from immune to the prejudices of her time. Her portrayal of certain characters in Uncle Tom's Cabin has been critiqued for perpetuating stereotypes, a reflection of the limitations of her perspective. It's a reminder that even trailblazers are products of their environments, and progress is often an imperfect, incremental journey. So, what's Harriet Beecher Stowe's legacy, really? It's a multifaceted tapestry woven from courage, conviction, and controversy. Her life and work remind us that change is often messy, that heroes are rarely perfect, and that the stories we tell can shape the world in ways we never imagined. Harriet's pen may have been mightier than a plantation owner's whip, but it was her relentless spirit that truly carved her place in history. As we wrap up this deep dive into Harriet's life, take a moment to reflect on the power of one voice among many. Her story is a testament to the impact of collective action and the enduring relevance of speaking truth to power. In a world that still grapples with inequality and injustice, Harriet's legacy is a call to arms for all who dare to dream of a better tomorrow. Her life reminds us that the fight for justice is ongoing, and there's room for all of us in the narrative. So, the next time you find yourself pondering the power of a story, remember Harriet Beecher Stowe. Remember her triumphs and trials, her impact and imperfections, and know that in the tapestry of history, her threads continue to weave through the fabric of our shared human experience. Here's to Harriet, a woman whose voice still echoes, whose words still resonate, and whose legacy continues to inspire. Trier in the early 19th century wasn't exactly the bustling metropolis you'd imagine as the birthplace of revolutionary ideas. It was more of a sleepy German town, known for its ancient Roman ruins and not much else. But in 1818, it produced one of history's most notorious thinkers, Karl Marx. Now, Karl was not the Marx we picture with the impressive beard and the serious gaze right from the get-go. No, young Karl was more of a mischief maker with a penchant for pushing boundaries, both intellectual and otherwise. Growing up, Karl wasn't exactly the poster child for academic rigor. Sure, he eventually got the degrees, but his school days were less about hitting the books and more about hitting the local taverns. He attended Trier High School, where he showed flashes of brilliance, but also a tendency to procrastinate like it was an Olympic sport. Teachers noted his talent, but were less impressed with his discipline, or lack thereof. He was the kind of student who could write a killer essay, if he remembered to turn it in. Rumor has it, he once scribbled a paper on Roman law in a single night, fueled by coffee and sheer panic, an early indicator of his later penchant for last-minute revolutionary manifestos. Karl's academic journey took him to the University of Bonn in 1835, a place where he was supposed to study law, but instead majored in beer. He joined a drinking society, as one does when law lectures seem less appealing than a pint with friends. This was also where his penchant for dueling emerged. Yes, dueling, as in the old-fashioned, pistols-at-dawn type of affair. He got into a bit of trouble, which didn't sit well with his father, Heinrich Marx, who was footing the bill and expected a return on his investment in the form of a lawyer's son, not a beer-guzzling poet. Recognizing the need for a course correction, Heinrich packed Karl off to the University of Berlin, hoping the Prussian capital's more serious academic environment might instill some discipline. Berlin at the time was a hotbed of intellectual activity, brimming with Hegelian philosophy, which was the intellectual equivalent of rocket fuel for young thinkers. Here, Marx found his true passion, not law, but philosophy and history. In Berlin, Marx was drawn to the young Hegelians, a group of radical thinkers who liked to poke holes in the status quo. He started to develop his own ideas about society and economics, reading voraciously and writing extensively. His doctoral thesis, which he actually completed, was on the differences between Democritus and Epicurus, because apparently existential Greek philosophy was preferable to legal statutes. It was during this period that Marx first encountered Friedrich Engels in 1842, though their legendary bromance didn't kick off immediately. Engels, the son of a wealthy industrialist, was the perfect foil to Marx's more chaotic persona. If Marx was the messy brain behind the operation, Engels was the organized one, complete with a trust fund that could support their revolutionary aspirations. They met in Cologne, and while their initial encounter was brief, it laid the groundwork for a partnership that would change the world, or at least give it a hefty nudge. Europe in the 1840 was a place of stark contrasts and seething discontent. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and while it brought technological advances, it also widened the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Factories were sprouting like mushrooms after rain, but workers were little more than cogs in the machine, laboring for long hours in dreadful conditions for meager pay. In England, for example, the average working day for a factory laborer was 14 hours, which makes your average modern workday seem like a vacation. This was the world Marx was looking at, an economic system that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. His writings began to reflect this, critiquing capitalism not just as an economic system, but as a social cancer. The romantic notion of the hard-working industrialist creating prosperity for all was, to Marx, a myth. Instead, he saw a handful of capitalists reaping the rewards while the majority toiled in poverty. He called it as he saw it, exploitation, pure and simple. Marx's ideas didn't spring from a vacuum. They were shaped by the gritty realities of 19th century Europe, where the promise of progress often came at a human cost. His revolutionary vision was fueled by the belief that this system wasn't just flawed, but fundamentally unjust. He wanted to tear it down and build something better from the ashes, though he wasn't entirely sure what that something looked like just yet. As Marx and Engels began to collaborate, they realized their complementary strengths. Engels had the practical experience of working in his family's textile business, witnessing firsthand the conditions Marx theorized about. Meanwhile, Marx's relentless drive to uncover the root causes of societal ills kept them both grounded in the academic rigor needed to challenge established norms. Engels was often the one who made sure Marx's sprawling ideas were coherent enough for publication. Their partnership was solidified through many late-night discussions and endless cups of coffee. The lifeblood of 19th century intellectuals were like Sherlock and Watson, if Watson had a better mustache and more radical ideas about workers' rights. Together, they began to draft what would become the Communist Manifesto, a document that would shake the foundations of the world. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, let's leave Marx and Engels in the midst of their brainstorming sessions, grappling with the economic forces of their time and dreaming of a world where the worker wasn't just another brick in the wall. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the curtain was about to rise on a drama unlike any the world had seen before. As Marx and Engels sketched out their revolutionary vision, an opportunity to refine their ideas arose in the form of a city that was practically a synonym for intellectual ferment: Paris. In the 1840, the French capital was the pulsating heart of radical thought, where the cafes were as much battlegrounds as the barricades. Here, Marx found himself surrounded by a raucous mix of political exiles, philosophers, and rabble-rousers, all chattering away in a dozen languages about this new world order they were supposedly on the brink of creating. Paris was a place where ideas bubbled over like a pot left on the stove too long. It was a city that embraced the notion that revolutions were as essential to life as wine and baguettes. For Marx, it was the perfect place to test his theories against the intellectual heavyweights of the time. He mingled with the likes of Proudhon, who was known for his anarchistic tendencies and a quote that would have made for a great Twitter bio: "Property is theft." The two didn't see eye to eye on everything, but their debates were the kind of intellectual sparring that sharpened Marx's critique of capitalism. In Paris, Marx also tried his hand at journalism. He wrote for the Rhenish Zeitung, where his articles were as likely to skewer the Prussian monarchy as they were to critique the latest economic policies. His pen was a sword, and he wielded it with a flair that made his prose both cutting and compelling. Imagine a 19th century version of a Twitter roast, but with more footnotes and less brevity. His journalistic career was marked by his knack for blending biting humor with incisive analysis, a combination that made his writing resonate with those fed up with the status quo. However, it wasn't all essays and editorials. Marx's time in Paris wasn't without its lighter moments. One story that's often recounted involves Marx getting so engrossed in a heated debate at a cafe that he absent-mindedly walked out without paying his tab. When the cafe owner caught up with him, Marx reportedly quipped that he was engaged in a more valuable transaction: the exchange of ideas. The owner, unimpressed by the philosophical currency, insisted on cash. Amidst these intellectual escapades, Marx found himself drawn into the orbit of the League of the Just, a group of utopian socialists who were more optimistic than organized. The League was looking for a more coherent ideology, and Marx, with Engels by his side, seemed like the perfect candidates to provide it. So, in 1847, the duo helped transform the League into the Communist League, a group that swapped utopian dreams for something more grounded in economic realities. Their motto: "Working men of all countries unite," a rallying cry that would later echo through history. This transformation wasn't just about changing a name. It was about crafting a manifesto that could serve as a blueprint for the workers' movement. Enter the Communist Manifesto, a document as revolutionary in its prose as it was in its politics. Written in the winter of 1847-1848, the manifesto was a call to arms for the proletariat, urging them to overthrow the bourgeoisie and establish a classless society. It was a radical departure from the pie-in-the-sky visions that characterized much of socialist thought at the time. Instead, Marx and Engels offered a hard-nosed analysis of capitalism's contradictions, backing up their claims with historical examples and economic data. The manifesto wasn't some dry treatise destined to gather dust on a library shelf. It was a firebrand of a document, starting with the unforgettable line, "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism." Talk about a dramatic opening. Marx's knack for mixing theatrical flair with rigorous argumentation made the manifesto a compelling read, even if its proposals were, to put it mildly, controversial. During this period, Marx and Engels were living in a whirlwind of activity. They were attending meetings, debating fellow socialists, and trying to keep the League from falling apart over factional squabbles. And of course, there was the ever-present challenge of making ends meet. Despite Engels' financial assistance, Marx's finances were perpetually in disarray. It didn't help that he had a tendency to spend money he didn't have, a habit that would haunt him for much of his life. It's worth noting that Engels wasn't just Marx's intellectual partner. He was also his financial lifeline. Without Engels' support, Marx might have spent more time dodging creditors than drafting manifestos. By the time the manifesto was published, in February 1848, Europe was on the brink of revolution. The timing couldn't have been more serendipitous, though Marx and Engels couldn't have predicted just how quickly things would spiral. The spring of 1848 saw a wave of uprisings across the continent as workers and peasants rose up against oppressive regimes. It was as if the manifesto had ignited a powder keg, though in truth, the economic and social conditions had been smouldering for years. Marx's stint in Paris came to an abrupt end when the French government, ever wary of foreign agitators, decided he was persona non grata. Deported back to Germany, Marx found himself in the thick of revolutionary fervor once again. But that's a tale for another day. For now, let's leave Marx and Engels in the bustling streets of Paris, their heads full of revolutionary ideas and their pockets conspicuously empty. The Communist Manifesto was out in the world, a ticking time bomb of prose and politics, just waiting for the right moment to explode. And explode it would, but not without a few more twists and turns in the story of Karl Marx. As Marx and Engels left Paris with their heads buzzing with revolutionary ideas and their pockets as empty as a politician's promises, they found themselves heading to London, the city that would become Marx's home for the rest of his life. Now, if you're picturing Marx living the high life in the British capital, think again. His London years were less about luxury and more about financial gymnastics, where paying the rent was a monthly cliffhanger. Let's set the stage. London in the 1850 was a sprawling beast of a city, with more than 2 million souls crammed into its smoky embrace. The Industrial Revolution had transformed it into a global hub of commerce and industry, but the economic miracle had a dark side. The city was a place where fortunes could be made, but for Marx, it was a relentless reminder of economic inequality, the very beast he spent his life trying to slay. Marx settled in Soho, then a far cry from the hipster haven it is today. His accommodation was anything but glamorous. Picture a cramped, dingy apartment on Dean Street, where he lived with his wife, Jenny, and their growing brood. If you're thinking he had a cozy study with books lining the walls, think again. Marx's study was often the kitchen table, his writing punctuated by the clamour of family life. It was in this chaotic setting that he penned some of his most influential works, proving that you don't need a corner office to change the world. Financial struggles were a constant companion, and Marx's monetary woes were almost comical in their relentlessness. Despite Engels' best efforts to keep the wolf from the door, Marx had a talent for spending money he didn't have. He was forever dodging creditors, a reality that seemed to spur his revolutionary fervor. After all, nothing sharpens the mind quite like the threat of eviction. One story that captures the absurdity of Marx's financial situation involves a pawnshop. In a desperate bid to pay the bills, Marx once pawned his overcoat, a decision he would regret when he found himself unable to leave the house in winter. Unless, of course, he wanted to freeze. It's a scene worthy of a Dickens novel, with Marx playing the role of the beleaguered intellectual instead of an impoverished clerk. Amidst these personal dramas, Marx was hard at work on his magnum opus, Das Kapital. This wasn't just any book. It was his attempt to dissect the beast of capitalism with the precision of a surgeon. Published in 1867, Das Kapital wasn't exactly a bestseller, but it was a monumental work that laid bare the mechanics of economic exploitation. Marx approached capitalism like a detective solving a mystery, peeling back layers of economic jargon to reveal the grim reality underneath. He argued that capitalism was inherently unstable, prone to crises and exploitation. His analysis was rooted in data. He was not just waving around abstract ideas, but backing them up with figures and historical examples. It was less a manifesto and more an economic autopsy, examining how the capitalist system chewed up workers and spat them out. Despite the groundbreaking insights of Das Kapital, the reaction from Marx's contemporaries was more of a shrug than a standing ovation. The book was dense, packed with complex ideas that weren't exactly light reading. Imagine trying to slog through its pages after a long day at the factory. No wonder it didn't fly off the shelves. But Marx wasn't riding for immediate fame or fortune. He was planting seeds for future generations, even if he didn't live to see them blossom. Now, let's address the myth. Marx as the untouchable intellectual giant, operating in a cloud of ideas, impervious to the mundane concerns of everyday life. The reality, a man who juggled revolutionary thoughts with the day-to-day grind of keeping his family fed. Marx was an intellectual powerhouse, no doubt, but he was also a human being, one who experienced the frustrations and failures of life just like the rest of us. His health was another constant battle. Marx suffered from a host of ailments, not least of which was a persistent skin condition that was likely exacerbated by stress and poor living conditions. It's a reminder that even the greatest minds have to contend with the frailties of the human body. Yet, despite these challenges, Marx's faith in his ideas never wavered, was convinced that his critique of capitalism was not just valid, but necessary. He was a man who could see the forest for the trees, understanding that the struggles of his own life were a microcosm of the larger systemic issues he was trying to address. So, while his contemporaries might have ignored Das Kapital, Marx remained undeterred. He was playing the long game, knowing that his ideas were like slow-burning fuses, destined to ignite debates that would shake the world. And shake the world they would, but not without a few more twists and turns in the saga of Karl Marx. As we leave Marx in his crowded London flat, scribbling away at his next big idea, it's clear that his story is far from over. The revolutionary vision he crafted in those years would eventually inspire movements and debates that echoed across the globe. But for now, let's leave him with his ink-stained fingers and his head full of dreams, as he continues to wrestle with the economic leviathan that is capitalism. There's more to come, so stay tuned. It's a tale with plenty of drama left to unfold. As Marx sat in his cramped London flat, ink-stained fingers dancing over paper, his revolutionary ideas were about to make their grand debut on Europe's turbulent stage. The year was 1848, and Europe was the continent's version of a powder keg, with Marx's theories acting as the spark. It was the year when the so-called springtime of nations saw revolutions erupting like a series of economic earthquakes, shaking monarchies and stirring the masses. Now, if you think this was all orchestrated by Marx from his London headquarters, think again. The revolutions of 1848 were more like a spontaneous combustion than a planned detonation. They were fueled by a potent mix of economic downturns, bad harvests, and a general sense of enough is enough among Europe's working class and peasantry. To add some numbers to the mix, the economic crisis of 1847 had seen bread prices in France alone soar by over 60%, leaving families to choose between dinner and dignity. In this chaos, Marx's Communist Manifesto found its audience, turning up like the surprise guest at a party no one really invited, but everyone ended up talking about. Its call for the proletariat to unite resonated with the discontented masses, even if many didn't quite grasp all the nuances of Marx's economic theories. Let's be honest, the manifesto wasn't exactly bedtime reading for most factory workers, but its central message was clear: rise up against your oppressors. The revolutions themselves were a mixed bag. In France, the monarchy of Louis-Philippe was toppled, creating yet another republic. Because if there's one thing the French love, it's rebranding their government. Meanwhile, in Germany and the Austrian Empire, demands for constitutional reforms and national unification were met with a combination of enthusiasm and military crackdowns. The Habsburgs, never ones to take a hint, responded with their usual blend of force and abstinence. Despite the initial euphoria, the revolutions of 1848 were largely short-lived. By 1849, many uprisings had been quashed, leaving behind a trail of dashed hopes and exiled leaders. But the legacy of these revolts was more enduring than the immediate outcomes suggested. They set the stage for future political movements and laid bare the chasm between the ruling classes and those they ruled over. Marx, watching from the sidelines, was both thrilled and exasperated. Here was the revolution he had called for, but the results were a far cry from the utopia he envisioned. The reality was that many revolutionary leaders were more interested in political power than in the kind of radical economic overhaul Marx dreamed of. It was like inviting someone to a protest only to find out they came for the snacks. In the aftermath, Marx's ideas continued to spread, sometimes in ways that would leave him scratching his head. Various political movements picked bits and pieces from his theories, often twisting them to suit their agendas. It's the classic tale of the author's intent getting lost in translation. A prime example was the rise of socialist and labor parties across Europe, which took Marx's critique of capitalism to heart, but often ignored the whole, overthrow the bourgeoisie part. It was socialism light, revolutionary in rhetoric, but reformist in practice. In France, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the original Napoleon, took advantage of the post-revolutionary chaos to worm his way into power, eventually declaring himself Emperor Napoleon Roman III. Talk about a plot twist. Meanwhile, in Germany, the seeds of socialism were planted, later growing into a full-fledged movement that would see the formation of the Social Democratic Party in 1875. Marx's ideas were gaining traction, but not always in the way he intended. And then there was the Russian Empire, where Marx's theories found fertile ground among intellectuals and revolutionaries. Fast forward a few decades, and Lenin would pick up Marx's mantle, albeit with a distinctly Russian twist. But that's jumping ahead in our story. Despite the mixed reception of his theories, Marx remained convinced of their validity. He spent the next years refining his ideas, often in spirited debates with fellow socialists who thought his vision was too extreme or not extreme enough. If there's one thing leftist movements are known for, it's their love of a good internal squabble. Throughout this period, Marx continued to write prolifically, contributing to various publications and honing his critique of capitalism. His work was a blend of rigorous analysis and biting satire, targeting the hypocrisies of the ruling class with a precision that would make a modern-day stand-up comedian envious. Yet, while Marx's theories were spreading, his personal life remained as chaotic as ever. Financial troubles continued to haunt him, and his health was a constant concern. It was as if the universe was conspiring to test his resolve at every turn. But if Marx was anything, he was persistent. He was a man who could see beyond his immediate struggles to a future where his ideas might reshape the world. And so, as the dust of the 1848 revolutions settled, Marx found himself both a prophet and a pariah. His ideas were revered by some, reviled by others, but they were undeniably influential. He had unleashed a new way of thinking about society and economics, one that would continue to echo through the halls of power and the streets of protest. As we leave Marx at this crossroads, his mind buzzing with new ideas and his spirit unbowed by the setbacks, it's clear that his story is far from over. The revolutionary vision he crafted was like a seed, taking root in the fertile soil of 19th century Europe, ready to grow into something far greater than even Marx could have imagined. Stay tuned, because the tale of Karl Marx and his impact on the world is just getting started. Now, with the seed of Marx's revolutionary vision planted and taking root, let's fast forward to the world left in the wake of his death in 1883. Marx passed away at the age of 64, not in a lavish estate teeming with disciples, but in a modest house in London, surrounded by books and the tattered remnants of his grand ideals. He wasn't a rock star of the revolution in life. Instead, his funeral was attended by about a dozen mourners, a testament to his complex mix of obscurity and influence at the time. But death, as it turns out, was just the beginning for Marx's ideas. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's that a good revolution never dies. It merely waits for an opportune moment. And Marx's theories were no exception. In the decades that followed, his ideas would be adapted, and occasionally mangled in ways that would leave even the most imaginative sci-fi authors scratching their heads. Enter the 20th century, a period where history decided to put Marx's theories through a blender. The Russian Revolution of 1917 saw Lenin and the Bolsheviks take the Marxist baton and sprint with it, albeit in a direction Marx himself might have found questionable. They built a model of governance that was less about Marx's vision of a stateless society and more about creating a state that resembled a bureaucratic behemoth. Lenin's Russia, and later Stalin's Soviet Union, took Marx's critique of capitalism and ran it through a meat grinder of political expediency, resulting in a version of socialism that was as much about state control as it was about worker empowerment. In the Soviet model, the government owned the means of production, and the proletariat was supposed to be in charge. But in reality, it often felt like trading one set of bosses for another, except this time, the bosses wore drab uniforms and spoke in slogans. The irony: Marx's critique of capitalist exploitation was used to justify a system that, in practice, often replicated the very inequalities it sought to eliminate. The Soviet Union was like a Marxist funhouse mirror, reflecting some of his ideas while distorting others beyond recognition. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, socialist and labor movements took Marx's ideas and gave them a decidedly reformist twist. Countries like Sweden and Norway built welfare states that aimed to marry the best parts of capitalism and socialism, creating systems where social safety nets cushioned the economic blows that capitalism sometimes dealt. This wasn't Marx's revolution, but it was a nod to his critique of unchecked capitalism. The Nordic model, with its progressive taxes and public services, was a kinder, gentler take on economic justice, one that Marx might have appreciated even if it didn't involve storming the barricades. Across the Atlantic, the United States took a different path. While Marxism never gained the same foothold in America as it did in Europe, his ideas still sparked debates that influenced labor rights and economic policies. The New Deal of the 1930, with its focus on public works and social security, echoed some of the concerns Marx raised about economic inequality, even if FDR wasn't exactly quoting Das Kapital in his fireside chats. Fast forward again, and we land in the post-Cold War era, where Marx's ideas continue to resonate, albeit in new and unexpected ways. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 seemed to herald the triumph of capitalism, but Marx's ghost was far from laid to rest. As globalization accelerated, the gap between the rich and the poor widened, and the gig economy introduced a new kind of worker exploitation that Marx would have found eerily familiar. The top 1% now controls more than half of the world's wealth, a statistic that would make Marx's beard bristle with indignation. In the modern world, Marx's critiques of capitalism have found new life in movements advocating for economic justice and environmental sustainability. The rise of populism and the growing concern over climate change have sparked fresh interest in Marx's ideas, as people search for solutions to the ills of a world that sometimes feels like it's teetering on the edge of a capitalist abyss. The Occupy Wall Street movement, with its rallying cry against the excesses of the financial elite, is a testament to the enduring relevance of Marx's message. And yet, for all his influence, Marx's legacy is a study in contradiction. He's been hailed as a visionary and vilified as a radical, his ideas both revered and reviled. The humor in all of this is that Marx, the man who spent his life critiquing economic systems, was himself often at the mercy of them. His life was a series of financial misadventures, from unpaid debts to pawning his possessions, highlighting the very economic inequalities he sought to dismantle. In evaluating Marx's legacy, it's essential to separate the man from the myth. He wasn't a prophet with all the answers, but a thinker who dared to ask the hard questions. His work wasn't a blueprint for utopia, but a challenge to imagine something better. As the world grapples with economic inequality, environmental crises, and the complexities of globalization, Marx's critiques remain as relevant as ever, not because they offer easy solutions, but because they push us to question the status quo and demand a fairer, more just world. So, as we wrap up our journey through the life and legacy of Karl Marx, let's remember him not as a deity of revolution, but as a man with ink-stained fingers and a mind that refused to settle for the world as it was. His story is a reminder that ideas have power, that they can outlive their originators and take on lives of their own. Whether you see him as hero or heretic, there's no denying that Marx's vision continues to provoke, inspire, and challenge us to imagine a world where justice isn't just a dream, but a reality we can build together.